My name is Nicole, and I'm a 34-year-old hairdresser. I've been honing my skills as the chief stylist at the salon owned by my husband Michael, who's just a few years older than me. Our story began through a mutual connection, and I was instantly drawn to Michael's warm and approachable demeanor. 4 years ago, we sealed our bond in marriage. However, there's a significant player in our lives. My husband's mother, Victoria. Divorced during Michael's junior high years, she proudly raised him single-handedly. While I admire her strength, Victoria's unwavering belief in her authority over Michael's life can be suffocating. When we tied the knot, she insisted on asserting her opinions on everything from the wedding arrangements to our choice of honeymoon destination and even the decor of our new home. I had my own dreams for our special moments like the wedding ceremony and honeymoon, not to mention our future abroad. Yet whenever I dared to voice my desires, Victoria swiftly shut them down. Even Michael's attempts to mediate were met with her firm assertion of dominance, often accompanied by the reminder of her role as his mother. It's like tossing pearls before swine, as the saying goes. You don't need such an extravagant wedding dress. Honestly, if you're behaving like this now, I shudder to think about our future together. What kind of upbringing did your parents give you? With those words, she not only dismissed my preferences but also insulted my parents. It left me anxious about what lay ahead. My parents, ever the voice of reason, suggested, take a moment to reconsider. I'm deeply sorry for my mother's intrusion. Her behavior was uncalled for, but I am committed to building a happy family with Nicole. I'll do whatever it takes. Please will you bless our union? Michael's apology was sincere, and in that moment, both my parents and I felt assured that he would stand by me in the years to come, and so we decided to proceed with the marriage. From the wedding ceremony to our new home, every decision was dictated by my mother-in-law's preferences. At home, my own mother advised, sometimes it's best to concede now for a better future. I understand you're trying to maintain harmony with your mother-in-law, but by yielding now, you're actually positioning yourself to collect on her debt in the future, leveraging her advice. Reluctantly, I acquiesced, but now, 4 years later, I rue that decision more deeply than the ocean and loftier than the mountains. Michael, can we discuss something about work? I have a junior chamber meeting tonight. Yesterday was a shopping district gathering, and today's another meeting. Last week was filled with dinners and social events. When do we have time to sit down and talk? Isn't every event part of your business? I'm not criticizing. You sound like you're complaining. Now that we have 3 stores, it's only logical that we discuss various aspects of management, isn't it? I've entrusted everything regarding the stores to you, Nicole. Your one commendable trait, without any formal education or prestigious family background, is your talent as a hairdresser. Thus, it's only natural for you to focus on boosting sales, right? So, why do you act like you need my input? Doesn't that seem odd? Here we go again. 4 years have passed since we launched our hair salon business from scratch. With the successful opening of our 3rd store and plans for a 4th by year-end, it's a significant milestone. However, as our business expands and Michael garners praise as a young entrepreneur, he increasingly regards me with disdain. I can handle him commenting on my education and background, but his constant belittling, criticizing everything from my appearance to my fashion sense, and even comparing me to rival stylists is just too much. What's worse, if I have to postpone a task he's asked for or don't respond to his messages right away, he gives me the silent treatment. During these times, he stays out late, disregards the meals I've prepared, and ostentatiously opts for takeout or convenience store sandwiches and coffee. He spends more time at his mother's place, even taking baths there. At first, I didn't know how to break through his silence. I kept cooking and preparing everything as if he would come home hungry and tired, even though I knew he wouldn't. I'd stay up late, anxiously waiting for him to return, uncertain of when he'd be back. Meanwhile, my mother-in-law would launch her verbal attacks. I always knew you weren't good enough for Michael, but I never imagined you'd be this incompetent. Why is he ignoring me? What have you done? Do you really have no idea? It's unbelievable. Are you mad at me for something I did? If Michael told you something, please tell me. It's pointless to talk to someone who's clueless about their own flaws, isn't it? With a laugh, she leaves me without an answer, after enduring his silent treatment for a while, just when I'm about to lose my patience. I'm home. Oh, I'm starving. What's on the menu tonight? He strolls in casually, as if nothing had happened earlier. I'm relieved he's speaking to me, but deep down, I dread being ignored again. Unconsciously, I find myself bending over backward to please Michael, catering to his every mood. It wasn't until Rebecca, a new stylist who joined the company this spring, pointed it out to me one day that I realized the extent of it all. That particular day, Michael was, as usual, ignoring me, skipping meals and remaining silent. Not wanting the food I had prepared to go to waste, I packed his leftovers into a lunchbox and brought it to the store. While I was eating it for lunch, Rebecca approached me. "Hey, Nicole, did you make that lunchbox yourself?" Yeah. It's just some leftovers from yesterday, though. I don't mean to pry into personal matters, especially as a newcomer, but do you realize that Michael seems to be controlling you? What do you mean by control? What are you getting at? I might be overstepping, but isn't Michael completely ignoring you right now? Yeah, he is. I had a feeling something was off. I noticed him chatting and laughing with everyone else in the staff room but completely ignoring you. And that incident where he rudely brushed off your hand when nobody was looking, it was clear as day. And then there's that lunchbox, filled with just grilled mackerel and meat and potatoes. It's obvious you just packed last night's dinner leftovers, right? It's a far cry from your usual colorful, well-balanced lunches. After Rebecca's observations, memories of my mother's similar experiences flooded back. She went through the same ordeal before divorcing my biological father. Hearing Rebecca's story, I learned that her parents split during her freshman year of high school, with her father often subjecting her mother to the same silent treatment as Michael. It all began with trivial things, gradually escalating until it seemed like a switch had been flipped, and he completely shut her out. My mother endured countless tears. I see. In time, she began seeking my father's approval in everything, her once bright smile turning submissive. It was agonizing to witness. Rebecca explained that Michael's silent treatment was a tactic to control me, leaving me worried and insecure while he maintained a position of dominance, smirking all the while. Think about it. In a healthy relationship, if your partner is upset, you'd be concerned and hurt too. But people like Michael, they actually relish in seeing their partner distressed and vulnerable. It's sickening. After Rebecca's candid insight, I found myself losing the urge to panic as I once did, even amidst Michael's moodiness and his habit of ignoring me or my mother-in-law's persistent prodding. Instead, viewing the situation through that lens, I began to see only Michael's immaturity, his overwhelming self-centeredness, and my mother-in-law's unrelenting malice, with no attempts to rein him in. But it seemed they didn't appreciate my newfound perspective. The chilling silence from both Michael and my mother-in-law gradually became routine. He scarcely came home anymore, and when he did, he'd seclude himself in his room. He stopped appearing at both the store and the company, leaving me to handle everything alone. Then, on a day like any other, a rare day off for the store, I decided to thoroughly clean our house for the first time in ages. Usually I relied on the Roomba and Brava, but with the pleasant weather, I figured I'd tackle every nook and cranny for a change. Lost in thought, I began wiping the windows while my favorite music played from my smartphone. That's when Michael and my mother-in-law silently entered the house, unlocking the door with a click as they settled onto the living room sofa. As my husband and mother-in-law sat there, I decided to quickly brew some tea. What an inconsiderate wife you are. But can't we bid farewell to this type of wife soon? It'll be a breath of fresh air. That's what they remarked as I reluctantly prepared the tea and set it on the sofa table, feeling bewildered. You see, Michael is expecting a child now, so it's time for you to step aside and make a swift exit. We'll give you a grace period of about 2 weeks to vacate this apartment. And naturally, you'll need to resign from your job as well, without any severance pay, of course. That's what they declared. Michael is having a child? Does that mean he's been unfaithful? And I'm being asked to leave. I'm losing my job with no severance pay either. Though we were in a silent standoff as a couple, my mind raced with questions upon hearing this sudden news, struggling to process it all. The next wife will be quite different from you. She hails from a wealthy family, graduated from a prestigious women's college, and then trained in the beauty capital, Paris. You simply can't compete with her, so it's best to accept it now. She's 3 months pregnant, and I'm eager to provide her with security as my wife soon. Indeed, I'm looking forward to it. Without a doubt, a wonderful child will be born. They uttered whatever they please. So, if she's 3 months pregnant, does that mean the child is a product of infidelity? Yeah, and? Emily and I just met in the wrong order. We were truly connected by the red thread of fate. So, you want me to leave because you want to marry your supposed soulmate now? That's been the gist of it. You're a bit slow on the uptake. As I watched Michael and my mother-in-law's nonchalant demeanor, a headache began to throb at my temples. Finally, I mustered the strength to request some time alone to contemplate, asking them to leave. It seems it takes time to grasp things with a scattered mind like yours. We understand, they replied before retreating to my mother-in-law's quarters. Left alone, I found myself unable to resume cleaning and instead sank onto the floor. Yet amidst the dimness, I noticed my smartphone's screen illuminating with an incoming call. It was from Rebecca. Rebecca. Oh, Nicole, are you at home right now? Yeah, I am. With my brief response, Rebecca announced she was on her way over and promptly ended the call. About half an hour later, Rebecca arrived, her hands full with bulging eco bags. Sorry for barging in. I grabbed some random food and drinks for us, she announced cheerfully. After excusing herself to wash her hands, she swiftly arranged the deli food she brought onto the table. She fetched glasses from the kitchen, poured some craft beer, her newfound favorite, and declared, "Let's dig in before it gets cold," while handing me a spoon. Following her lead, I began to eat, savoring the fluffy omelette rice that filled my mouth. Tasty, isn't it? This place makes fantastic omelette rice, she remarked with a bright smile. I've brought a variety of things, so please take your time and enjoy them. It dawned on me that I had only had coffee and bread for breakfast, hardly constituting a proper meal. Despite being emotionally numb until then, hunger gnawed at me. It was a realization that struck me for the first time. We ate in silence for a while, and as we began to sip our beer, Rebecca brought up the safety group email from the boss, mentioning my departure from the store at the end of the month. I confided in her about my mother-in-law and Michael's demand for a divorce, followed by my decision to resign from the store. Rebecca fell silent for a moment upon hearing my response, but then she looked me straight in the eyes and asked, "What do you want, Nicole? I mean, what do you truly desire? Not what they dictate you should do. It's your life, Nicole. You're the one who decides which path to take. You should steer towards what you want." Those words from Rebecca brought an unexpected clarity to my heart. Let's get a divorce. There's not a single reason why I should remain with Michael and his family. I want a divorce. I want to start afresh, I replied resolutely. Michael had given me a 10-day grace period, but once I set my plans in motion, everything proceeded smoothly. With few personal belongings, I swiftly packed them into boxes provided by the moving company. I entrusted Rebecca with handling my belongings at the store, preferring not to face Michael until everything was settled. Simultaneously, I engaged a lawyer recommended by an acquaintance to draft documents demanding alimony and property division from Michael. After several property viewings, I signed a contract for a new place. Once the move was complete, I had the lawyer send documents to my mother-in-law. Shortly after the letter arrived, my inbox flooded with line messages and emails from both my mother-in-law and Michael. Deciding to address matters formally, I proposed a meeting at the lawyer's office. As I waited at the lawyer's office, my mother-in-law, Michael, and a young woman entered, all wearing smug smiles. When the lawyer inquired about the woman's identity, my mother-in-law spoke up, introducing her as Emily, who would soon become Michael's wife after our divorce. They appeared delighted. Unfazed, I simply asked if they would agree to our demands. Without hesitation, they agreed, viewing it as severance payment. "Consider it compensation for your future," Michael added kindly. They handed over the specified amount in cash, sealed in a bank envelope. I completed my section of the divorce papers, stamped them, and handed them over, bringing the process to an end. As we parted ways, I made it clear that I would not assist them in any way in the future, no matter what happened. "So, this is your last desperate plea." Okay, get it, you're upset. No need for the sarcasm," Emily retorted before they all exited the office, laughing. These days, I'm thriving as a top stylist at a bustling salon in the city center. Rebecca, who's been by my side since last month, is the same Rebecca who helped me see the truth during that crucial moment at the lawyer's office. I wasted no time in finding a new job, leveraging my past accolades and online recognition to secure a position swiftly. Thanks to this, I can live comfortably without relying on the consolation money or property division. Plus, I've started seeing someone I met at a joint training session with the sister store of my current workplace. Each day feels remarkably liberating and stress-free. So, When's the next date? Hey, don't tease your elders. Rebecca stayed on at Michael's salon for a while after I left. Ultimately, I convinced her to quit immediately. My decision was twofold: to safeguard Rebecca's reputation as a newcomer, avoiding any perception of impatience or lack of cooperation, and to shield her from any potential targeting by Michael and his mother, knowing she was still my friend. Reluctantly, Rebecca remained at the salon, and from what she's told me, the aftermath of Michael, his mother, and Emily was akin to a roller coaster drama. Emily strutted into the salon after my divorce, brimming with confidence as the new top stylist and field manager, but her reign was short-lived, lasting only a single day. The male staff member who had previously worked under me turned out to be Emily's classmate. Unaware of this, Emily made a grand entrance at the salon, accompanied by Michael, boasting about her Parisian training. "Wow, Emily, I thought you must be some extraordinary talent since you claim to have returned from Paris. But here you are," Thomas remarked. Thomas, what are you doing here?" Emily asked, taken aback. "I could ask you the same. I'm genuinely surprised. You were always struggling with the written tests, constantly getting reprimanded by the teacher. How did you, Emily, who barely made it through, end up in Paris?" "That's not true, is it?" "Don't make up stories, Thomas," Emily countered defensively. Well, don't you need a French hairstylist license to work in Paris? When did you suddenly become fluent in French like a native speaker?" Thomas persisted. "Well, I studied at university, didn't I?" "University? Wow," Emily replied, somewhat flustered. The Emily who once claimed to struggle with English during elective French conversations at beauty school found her disguise completely unraveling. A heated argument ensued between Emily, Michael, and Emily's mother-in-law, who rushed onto the scene. Things escalated, leading to a call to the police. The ensuing chaos prompted staff members to leave one by one, draining the salon of its vitality. Customers began to trickle away, and soon, the business hit rock bottom. Forced to shut down 2 of their stores, they attempted to salvage what they could at the original location, but it was too little too late. Last month, they were forced to close down completely. That must have been incredibly challenging. It was, but because of that, I was able to present my departure from the company as due to business circumstances, making the job interview process here much smoother. I'm glad we're working together again, but why did you choose this salon? Naturally, it's to learn directly from Nicole's expertise. Got it. I'll make sure to train you thoroughly. Sometime after Rebecca changed jobs, a letter arrived from Michael and his mother, delivered through the lawyer handling our divorce. It seemed they had no other means to reach me after I severed all communication, and even my parents staunchly refused contact. The letter droned on about how they had been duped by Emily, revealing that she wasn't pregnant after all, and that her entire background was fabricated. Emily had absconded with everything valuable, leaving Thomas in the lurch shortly after they lost the salon and the apartment they had used as collateral. The letter concluded with a plea for my help, painting me as their only hope in their time of need. After skimming through the letter, I promptly called the lawyer who had passed it on to me. "Please just let them know I'm not interested. There's no need to relay any more messages from them." And so, as Rebecca had assured me before, my life, charted in the direction I desired, was flourishing. I vowed never to allow another man to dictate my fate.
On my wedding day, my cruel stepmom ordered me to clean her dirty toilet. When I refused and said, "I'm not your servant," she became furious and shouted, "How dare you talk back to me?" In her anger, she grabbed a hockey stick and struck me on the head. I was badly injured and cried out for help. My fiancé heard my screams and rushed me to the hospital, saving my life. The very next day, I returned with a shocking revenge that no one expected. My name is Flora Andrews, and this is the story of how I rose above betrayal, abuse, and manipulation to reclaim my life. If someone had told me years ago that my life would take such an unexpected turn, I wouldn't have believed them. But life has a way of throwing the most unimaginable challenges at us, doesn't it? Let me start from the beginning. I was only 9 when my mother passed away. She was my rock, my light, and the warm presence that made our house feel like a home. After her death, everything changed. My father, Richard, remarried just a year later. His new wife, Victoria, was nothing like my mother. Where my mother had been kind and nurturing, Victoria was cold, calculating, and sharp-tongued. From the very first day she moved in, she treated me not as her stepdaughter, but as her servant. At first, I thought she just needed time to adjust. But as the days turned into months and then years, her disdain for me only grew. I became the target of her bitterness and jealousy. "Why are you just sitting there? Do the dishes," she'd snap at me, even if I had homework to complete. "What good are your books going to do you? A girl like you should know her place." Her resentment only intensified as I excelled in school. I was determined to honor my mother's memory by doing well in my studies, but every award I brought home felt like a spark to the fire of her hatred. "You think you're better than everyone else because you have a degree?" she sneered when I graduated from college with honors. "Let's see where all your education gets you when you're married and chained to a kitchen." The most painful part of it all was my father's silence. I remember how he used to be before Victoria came into our lives, strong, protective, and loving. But under her manipulative influence, he changed. It was as if she had him under spell. He stopped defending me and became a passive observer to her cruelty. I still remember one day when I was 16 and Victoria accused me of stealing money from her purse, money I never even saw. I begged my father to believe me, but he just stood there, silent, as Victoria screamed at me and grounded me for weeks. That was the day I realized I was on my own. But I didn't give up. I poured all my energy into my studies, knowing that education was my way out of this prison. By the time I turned 24, I had a stable job as a software engineer in New York City, and I was engaged to the most wonderful man, Daniel Carter. Daniel was everything Victoria wasn't: kind, supportive, and fiercely protective of me. He was a lawyer, and he had a natural sense of justice that made me feel safe for the first time in years. I often wondered what he saw in me, but he always said it was my strength and resilience that drew him in. Still, even with Daniel in my life, I couldn't fully escape Victoria's grip. She had a way of reminding me that no matter how successful I became, I was still under her control as long as I lived in that house. Yes, even with a stable job, I had been saving up to move out after my wedding. Victoria couldn't stand the idea of me being happy. She would nitpick every detail of my wedding plans, pretending to help but always finding ways to make me feel small. "That dress looks cheap," she'd say, or, "Are you sure Daniel will even show up? Men like him don't stay with women like you." But despite her constant jabs, I held my head high. I was about to start a new chapter in my life, and for once, I felt hopeful. Then came the morning of my wedding day, the day everything changed. I woke up feeling nervous, but excited. I got ready carefully, slipping into my dress and fixing my hair and makeup. As I stood in front of the mirror, I felt a surge of pride. For the first time, I looked and felt like the strong, confident woman I had worked so hard to become. But Victoria couldn't let me have that moment. She barged into my room, her face twisted with anger. "What are you doing just standing there?" she barked. "The bathroom needs cleaning. Get to it." I stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious right now? It's my wedding day." "Don't take that tone with me," she snapped. "You think you're above doing chores just because you're wearing a fancy dress? Get in there and clean it now." "No," I said firmly. For the first time, I stood my ground. "I am not your servant, and I never will be again. From today onward, you will do your own dirty work." Her eyes blazed with fury. "How dare you speak to me like that?" she screamed. Before I could react, she grabbed a hockey stick from the corner of the room and swung it at me. The pain was immediate and blinding. I fell to the floor, clutching my arm as blood pooled around me. I screamed for help, but my father just stood there, frozen, as if he couldn't decide whose side to take.
"It was Daniel who saved me."
Hearing my cries, he burst through the door, took one look at me on the floor, and rushed to my side. "Flora," he cried, lifting me into his arms. "What happened? Who did this to you?" I could barely speak through the pain, but I managed to whisper, "Victoria." His face darkened with anger. "You're going to be okay," he said, his voice firm. "I'm taking you to the hospital, and then we're going to make sure she pays for this." As he carried me out of the house, I caught one last glimpse of Victoria. She stood there, her face pale but defiant, as if she still believed she could get away with it. Little did she know, her reign of terror was about to end. As Daniel carried me out of that house, I felt a mix of emotions, pain, anger, and an overwhelming sense of relief. For years, I had endured Victoria's cruelty and my father's silent complicity, but that day, I knew things were finally going to change. At the hospital, doctors quickly tended to my injuries. The hockey stick had left a deep gash on my arm, and I had bruises forming on my ribs from where I had hit the floor. As I lay on the hospital bed, a nurse cleaned my wounds, and Daniel stayed by my side, holding my hand. "Flora," he said gently, "I need you to tell me everything. Don't hold anything back. What she did to you today is just the tip of the iceberg, isn't it?" I hesitated, feeling a lump in my throat. For years, I had buried the pain, convincing myself that it was normal or that I could handle it. But now, with Daniel looking at me with such concern and determination, I knew I couldn't stay silent anymore. "She's been like this for years," I began, my voice trembling. "Ever since she married my father. She treats me like a servant, always demeaning me, always finding ways to make me feel small. And my father," I paused, swallowing hard. "He just lets her. He doesn't defend me."
He never has.
Daniel's jaw tightened, and I could see the anger simmering in his eyes. "This ends now," he said firmly. "I promise you, Flora, she will pay for this. Both of them will." The next few days were a whirlwind. Daniel, being the meticulous lawyer that he was, wasted no time in gathering evidence. He insisted on documenting everything: my medical reports, photos of my injuries, even statements from the hospital staff who had treated me. At first, I wasn't sure if I wanted to pursue legal action. The idea of standing up to Victoria and my father felt overwhelming. But Daniel wouldn't let me back down. "You've been through enough," he said. "This isn't just about punishing them. It's about taking back control of your life. You deserve justice, Flora."
His words struck a chord with me.
He was right. I had spent too long living in fear, too long letting Victoria dictate my life. It was time to stand up for myself. With Daniel's guidance, we filed charges against Victoria for assault and against my father for neglect. The process was daunting, but Daniel was with me every step of the way. "I'll handle the legal side," he assured me. "All you have to do is tell your truth." The first time we went to the police station to file the complaint, I felt a wave of anxiety wash over me. Victoria's voice echoed in my mind, mocking me, telling me I was weak. But as I looked at Daniel standing beside me, his hand on my shoulder, I found the courage to speak up. The officers listened as I recounted what had happened on my wedding day and the years of abuse leading up to it. I saw their expressions change as I described Victoria's manipulative ways and my father's silence. "This isn't just about one incident," I told them. "This is about a lifetime of cruelty and neglect." The officers took my statement seriously, and within days, Victoria and my father were both served legal notices. Victoria, predictably, tried to deny everything. She spun her usual web of lies, painting herself as the victim and me as an ungrateful stepdaughter. "She's lying," she shrieked during one of the hearings. "She's just trying to ruin my life because she's jealous of me." But her lies didn't hold up against the mountain of evidence Daniel had collected. He had even tracked down a few former household staff who were willing to testify about the way Victoria had treated me over the years. As the case progressed, my father remained eerily silent. I couldn't tell if he was ashamed or if he still believed Victoria's lies. Either way, his lack of support hurt more than I wanted to admit. "Do you think he'll ever take responsibility?" I asked Daniel one evening as we reviewed the case files. Daniel sighed. "I don't know, Flora. But whether he does or not, this isn't about him. This is about you. Focus on that." Those words stayed with me. For so long, I had yearned for my father's approval, for him to stand up for me. But now I realized I didn't need it. What I needed was to stand up for myself. The courtroom became my battlefield. Daniel was relentless, dismantling Victoria's lies piece by piece. When she claimed I had attacked her first, he presented my medical reports, which clearly showed the severity of my injuries. When she tried to portray herself as a loving stepmother, he brought in witnesses who testified otherwise. Each day in court was exhausting, but it was also empowering. For the first time, I felt like I had a voice, like I wasn't just a victim anymore. Victoria's confidence began to crumble as the evidence against her piled up. Even my father, who had initially tried to downplay his role, couldn't escape the truth. His silence in the face of Victoria's abuse was just as damning as her actions. By the time the trial was nearing its end, I could see the fear in their eyes. They had spent years controlling me, but now the tables had turned. The courtroom was a place I had never imagined myself being. For years, I had learned to endure and suppress my pain, but now I was being asked to expose it all, to lay my scars bare for the world to see. Every time I stepped inside, I felt the weight of my past pressing down on me. But I reminded myself that this was about more than just me. This was about reclaiming my life and holding Victoria and my father accountable for everything they had done. Daniel was a force to be reckoned with in court. I had always admired his confidence and sharp mind, but seeing him in action was something else entirely. He was methodical, leaving no stone unturned, no detail overlooked. He approached the case with the same determination that had kept me going through all those years of torment. The first time I was called to the stand, I felt my throat tighten with nerves. The courtroom was packed, and I could feel every pair of eyes on me. Victoria sat at the defendant's table, her expression a mix of defiance and fear. My father sat next to her, his gaze fixed on the floor, as if he couldn't bear to look at me. "Flora," Daniel began, his voice calm and reassuring, "can you tell the court about the events that took place on the morning of your wedding day?" I took a deep breath and began. "I was in my room, getting ready for the ceremony," I said. "I had just finished putting on my dress when Victoria barged in. She told me to clean the bathroom, and when I refused, she hit me with a hockey stick." There was a murmur in the courtroom, and I felt my cheeks flush. It was one thing to tell Daniel what had happened, but it was another to say it in front of so many strangers. But I pressed on, recounting every detail of that day and the years of abuse that had led up to it. "She's always treated me like a servant," I said, my voice steadying as I spoke. "She would insult me, belittle me, and make me do all the household chores. And my father," I paused, glancing at him. He never stopped her. He just stood by and let it happen. Victoria's attorney tried to discredit me, of course. They painted me as a spoiled, ungrateful stepdaughter who was trying to ruin an innocent woman's reputation. But Daniel was ready for them. He presented the medical reports that documented my injuries, photos of the bruises Victoria had left on me, and testimony from the hospital staff who had treated me. One of the most powerful moments came when Daniel called a former housekeeper to the stand. She had worked for us for several years before quitting, and her testimony was damning. "Victoria was always harsh with Flora," the housekeeper said. "She would yell at her, insult her, and make her do all the work around the house. I even saw her slap Flora once when she didn't move fast enough. I quit because I couldn't stand to watch it anymore." Victoria's mask of confidence began to crack after that. She interrupted the proceedings several times, shouting accusations and denials, but each outburst only made her look more guilty. Her lawyer struggled to rein her in, and I could see the frustration on his face. My father's testimony was equally heartbreaking and infuriating. When he was called to the stand, he admitted that he had seen Victoria's behavior but claimed he had been powerless to stop her. "I didn't know what to do," he said, his voice trembling. She's strong-willed. I thought it was just her way of parenting." "Parenting?" Daniel's voice was sharp. "Do you consider ignoring years of abuse to be a form of parenting, Mr. Andrews?" My father didn't answer. He looked down, his silence speaking volumes. For years, I had craved his support, his validation. But sitting there, watching him struggle to justify his inaction, I realized I didn't need it anymore. He had failed me, and no excuse could change that. The trial stretched on for weeks. Each day was a battle, but with each piece of evidence presented, I felt stronger. Daniel called expert witnesses, including psychologists who explained the long-term effects of abuse and forensic specialists who validated the authenticity of the medical reports. Victoria's defense crumbled bit by bit. Her attempts to manipulate the narrative, to paint herself as the victim, were no match for the truth. By the time closing arguments were made, I could see the weariness in her eyes. She knew she had lost. But the hardest part was waiting for the verdict. It took the jury 2 days to deliberate, and those 48 hours felt like an eternity. Daniel stayed with me the entire time, reassuring me, reminding me that we had done everything we could. Finally, the day came. As the jury filed back into the courtroom, I held my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The foreperson stood and began to read the verdict. On the charge of assault, we find the defendant, Victoria Andrews, guilty. My eyes filled with tears as I heard the words. Victoria's face turned pale, her defiance replaced with disbelief. The court also found my father complicit in neglect, holding him accountable for his role in enabling the abuse. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of justice. But the story wasn't over yet. The moment the verdict was read, I felt a wave of emotions crash over me: relief, validation, and a bittersweet sense of victory. After years of suffering in silence, I had finally stood up for myself, and the truth had prevailed. Victoria was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, her face pale and her arrogance gone. My father, too, sat slumped in his seat, his once confident demeanor replaced with shame and regret. The sentencing came a few weeks later. Victoria received a prison sentence for assault, while my father faced severe financial penalties and was ordered to attend counseling for enabling her abuse. Watching them face the consequences of their actions was cathartic, but it didn't erase the scars they had left on me. Still, it marked the end of a dark chapter in my life and the beginning of something new. The media caught wind of the case, and it became a headline story. Reporters called it the betrayal trial, and while I didn't enjoy the attention, I knew it was important for people to see what justice could look like. I even received messages from strangers, people who had been through similar situations, thanking me for sharing my story. One day, a journalist asked me, "How do you feel now that it's over?" I thought about it for a moment before answering. It's not about how I feel. It's about showing others that they don't have to stay silent. Abuse thrives in silence, and speaking up is the first step toward ending it. But the story didn't end with the verdict. There was one final twist that no one, not even Daniel, had anticipated. During the investigation into Victoria's finances, it was discovered that she had been secretly funneling my father's wealth into offshore accounts for years. She had drained his assets, leaving him virtually bankrupt. When this was revealed, my father looked stunned. He had spent years blindly supporting Victoria, turning a blind eye to her abuse and giving her control over their finances. Now he was left with nothing. I wish I could say I felt sympathy for him, but I didn't. His silence had cost me so much, and now it had cost him everything. I hoped this would be a wake-up call for him, a chance to reflect on his choices. As for me, life began to move forward. Daniel and I finally had the wedding we had postponed. It was a small, intimate ceremony, nothing like the grand affair we had originally planned, but it was perfect. As I walked down the aisle, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. Daniel looked at me with so much love and pride that it brought tears to my eyes. "You're the strongest person I know," he whispered as we exchanged vows. "I'm so proud of you." With Daniel by my side, I began to rebuild my life. We moved into a cozy apartment in the city, far away from the house that had been the source of so much pain. I continue my work as a software engineer, but I also found a new purpose. Inspired by my journey, I started volunteering at a local organization that helps survivors of abuse. Sharing my story with others, hearing theirs in return, and working to provide resources for those in need gave me a sense of fulfillment I hadn't expected. One day, during a support group meeting, a young woman approached me. "I read about your case in the news," she said, her voice trembling. It gave me the courage to leave my abusive relationship. "Thank you." Her words stayed with me. They reminded me that even in the darkest moments, there is a chance to inspire change, to turn pain into something meaningful. As for Victoria, I heard that she struggled to adjust to life in prison. The woman who had once ruled over our household with an iron fist was now powerless, forced to confront the consequences of her actions. And my father? I don't know if he ever truly came to terms with what he had done or failed to do. He tried to reach out to me once, sending a letter asking for forgiveness. But I couldn't bring myself to respond. Forgiveness might come one day, but not yet. Now, as I sit here reflecting on everything that has happened, I realize how far I've come. I'm no longer the scared, submissive girl who lived in fear of her stepmother. I'm stronger now, more confident, and more determined than ever to live a life free from the shadows of my past. Daniel often tells me how proud he is of me, but the truth is, I'm proud of myself too. I stood up for what was right, and I reclaimed my life. My story isn't just about betrayal and revenge. It's about resilience, justice, and the power of speaking up. If there's one thing I've learned, it's that we are stronger than we think. And no matter how dark things may seem, there is always a way to find the light. My name is Flora Andrews, and this is my story. My sister showed a fake surgery report for her 6-year-old daughter to my husband, and he secretly sent $120,000 to her account without informing me. One day, I exposed her at a family event, and everyone was shocked. She brutally attacked me, so I called the cops, but when they arrived, my name is Nina, and I thought my life was simple, even perfect. Ethan and I were like any other young couple in Austin, Texas, working hard, saving up, and dreaming of a bright future. I was a graphic designer at a small but thriving agency, and Ethan was a marketing specialist at a local tech firm. We were planning to buy our first home, and maybe even start a family soon. Life felt good, stable, and full of possibilities. But all of that came crashing down on a quiet Tuesday evening. I was sitting at the desk in our tiny apartment, trying to finish some freelance work before dinner. My email pinged. At first, I ignored it. Spam, I assumed, but something about the subject line caught my eye. Your husband's secret transfers, proof attached. I froze. My heart raced as I hovered over the email. Was it a scam? A prank? But curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pushed me to open it. The message was brief, but gut-punching. Nina, you deserve to know the truth. Ethan has been sending thousands of dollars to his mother and sister. Attached is the proof. Check it for yourself. I didn't want to believe it. I clicked the attachment, hands trembling, and there it was, a list of transactions spanning over 2 years. Ethan had been transferring $5,000 every month to his mother, Linda, and his sister, Megan. The memo on each payment read, Sophia's surgery fund. Sophia was Megan and Daniel's 6-year-old daughter. Sweet and bubbly, with her curly hair and big brown eyes, she was the kind of kid who made you smile just by being around. Ethan and I had always adored her, and it wasn't unusual for him to send the occasional gift. But surgery? I didn't even know she was sick. A cold wave of realization swept over me. If these transfers were legitimate, why hadn't Ethan told me? And $5,000 a month, where was all that money coming from? Our savings, perhaps? The savings we'd been building for our first house. Our future? I was so lost in my thoughts that I didn't hear Ethan come in until he spoke. Hey, Nina, what's for dinners? I turned to face him, my mind a whirlwind of confusion and anger. Ethan, I said, trying to keep my voice steady, we need to talk. He looked at me, puzzled, then followed my gaze to the screen. The moment his eyes landed on the email, his expression changed, like a mask slipping off. Not surprise. Not confusion.
Guilt.
I can explain, he stammered, stepping closer to me. Explain what? I demanded. That you've been sending thousands of dollars to your mother and sister behind my back? That you've been draining our savings for Sophia's surgery? What surgery, Ethan? I didn't even know she was sick. He looked like he wanted to run, but there was nowhere to go. Finally, he slumped into the chair across from me.
It's not what you think, he said.
Then tell me what it is, I snapped. Ethan sighed and rubbed his temples. Sophia isn't sick. Megan, she said they needed the money for her surgeries, But I think it's more complicated than that. More complicated? I repeated, my voice rising. You've been hiding this for 2 years, Ethan. 2 years. How much in total? He hesitated before answering. About $120,000. I felt like the air had been knocked out of me. $120,000. Our entire down payment for the house. Our future.
Gone.
Megan and Mom said they were struggling, Ethan continued, his voice almost pleading. Daniel's freelance work wasn't steady. They said Sophia needed help, and they couldn't afford it. I couldn't just say no. I shook my head in disbelief. So instead, you lied to me. You let me think we were saving for a house while you funneled all our money to them. Nina, please try to understand, he said, reaching for my hand, but I pulled away. Understand what, Ethan? That your mother and sister have been manipulating you? That you let them? Or that you thought it was okay to lie to me about all of it? He didn't answer. He didn't have to. The truth was written all over his face. I stood up, grabbing my keys and bag. Where are you going? He asked, panic creeping into his voice. I need air, I said. Don't follow me. As I walked out the door, my mind was spinning. My life had turned upside down in a matter of minutes. The Ethan I thought I knew, the man I trusted, had been keeping secrets from me. And for what? For a family that seemed to take and take without a second thought? I didn't know where I was going, but I knew one thing. I wasn't going to let this go. If Ethan's mother and sister thought they could manipulate him, they were about to learn that they'd underestimated me. That night, I sat in my car, staring at the email on my phone. I felt betrayed. Yes, but also something else, a spark of determination. I wasn't just going to uncover the truth. I was going to make sure they paid for every lie, every manipulation, every stolen dollar. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about trust, respect, and the life Ethan and I had worked so hard to build. And I wasn't going to let anyone destroy that. Not Linda, not Megan, not anyone. After that night, I couldn't look at Ethan the same way. I didn't know if I was more angry or hurt, but I knew I needed answers. The next morning, I decided to dig deeper. If he wasn't going to tell me the whole truth, I'd find it myself. While Ethan was at work, I opened my laptop and started going through our joint account. It was worse than I thought. Not only had he drained most of our savings, but there were smaller, consistent withdrawals labeled with vague terms like household support and extra care for Sophia. The amounts varied, but they added up fast, thousands of dollars over time. I opened Megan's social media accounts next, my stomach tightening with every post. Her latest upload was a photo of her lounging by a pool, holding what looked like a designer handbag. The caption read, "Summer vibes. Nothing beats some well-deserved relaxation." There were more photos, too. Spa days, expensive dinners, vacations. It didn't add up. How could someone who was supposedly struggling afford all this? The more I scrolled, the angrier I became. Sophia wasn't in a single picture that hinted at surgery or recovery. Instead, she looked happy and healthy, smiling for the camera, holding toys and balloons. I felt sick. The story Megan and Linda had spun was falling apart, and I hadn't even scratched the surface. But I couldn't do this alone. I needed someone who knew them better, someone on the inside. My mind went to Daniel, Megan's husband. I'd always thought of him as quiet and reserved, more of an observer than a participant in his wife's flashy lifestyle. Maybe he knew something. Maybe he'd talk. I called him that afternoon. "Daniel, it's Nina," I said, trying to keep my voice calm. "Can we meet? I have some questions about Megan and Linda." There was a long pause on the other end before he sighed. "What's this about?" he asked, but his tone told me he already knew. "I think you know exactly what it's about," I said. "I just want the truth. Meet me at the coffee shop on 6th Street. Please." Daniel showed up 20 minutes late, looking like he hadn't slept in days. He sat across from me, fidgeting with his coffee cup, avoiding eye contact. "Megan's going to kill me for talking to you," he muttered. "I'm not here to cause trouble," I said firmly. "I just want to know what's going on. Why is Ethan sending them so much money? Is Sophia even sick?" He flinched at the mention of Sophia. "No," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper.
Sophia's fine.
She's never needed surgery. My heart sank. Then why the lies? Why tell Ethan it's for surgeries? Daniel hesitated, then leaned in closer, his voice low. Linda's behind all of it. She's been manipulating Megan for years, convincing her that family comes first, no matter the cost. Megan she goes along with it. She doesn't question it. And you? I asked. Why didn't you stop them? He laughed bitterly. Do you think I haven't tried? Linda sabotaged my job offers when I first moved here. She called potential employers, made up lies about my issues, told them I wasn't reliable. She wanted us to stay dependent on her and Ethan's money. I gave up fighting a long time ago. I stared at him, horrified. Why didn't you tell anyone? What good would it do? He asked. Linda has a way of making you feel powerless. She controls everything, Megan, Ethan, even me. And now she's dragging Sophia into it. I felt a surge of anger rise in my chest.
This has to stop, I said.
Ethan and I have already lost so much because of her. She can't keep getting away with it. Daniel looked at me, his eyes tired but wary. If you go after Linda, you better be ready for a fight. She doesn't play fair. When I got home that evening, Ethan was waiting for me. He looked nervous, like he knew I'd been digging. Nina, we need to talk, he said. You're right, we do, I replied, crossing my arms. But first, tell me this. Why didn't you tell me about the money? Why did you let them take so much from us? He looked down at the floor, ashamed. I thought I was helping, he said. Megan said they had no one else. Mom told me it was for Sophia, and I believed them. You believed them, I said, my voice shaking. But you didn't trust me enough to tell me the truth? I didn't want to drag you into it, he said, looking up at me with pleading eyes. I thought I could handle it on my own. Well, you didn't, I snapped. You let them manipulate you, Ethan. They've been lying to you this whole time. Sophia doesn't need surgery. She never did. His face went pale.
What?
Daniel told me everything, I said. Your mother and sister have been using you. And they're not just taking your money. They're destroying us. Ethan sank onto the couch, burying his head in his hands. I was trying to help, he whispered.
You didn't help anyone, I said.
You just let them take advantage of you. And now we're paying the price. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The room felt heavy with the weight of everything that had come to light. Finally, Ethan looked up at me, his eyes filled with determination. What do we do now? He asked. We fight back, I said. But we have to be smart about it. Linda's been playing this game for years, and she's good at it. If we're going to stop her, we need to be better. He nodded, a flicker of resolve in his expression. Whatever it takes, he said. And in that moment, I knew we were in this together. We were up against a master manipulator, but for the first time, I felt like we had a chance. This wasn't just about money anymore. It was about reclaiming our lives and taking down the person who had nearly destroyed them. The days after Ethan and I decided to fight back were a blur of planning, digging, and preparing. It felt like we were assembling pieces of a puzzle we hadn't even realized existed. But every new discovery only deepened the betrayal and my resolve. Ethan and I agreed that we needed hard evidence. Linda and Megan had built their lies so carefully, layer by layer, that exposing them wouldn't be easy. I needed proof that they had been manipulating Ethan for years, proof that would not only clear our names but also hold them accountable. That's where Daniel came in. One evening, Daniel showed up at our apartment, holding a folder thick with papers and a USB drive. He looked nervous but determined. I've been saving these for years, he said, handing them to me. Call it insurance. Linda and Megan always thought they were invincible, but I couldn't just sit back and do nothing. Inside the folder were bank statements, emails, and even text messages. It was all there, proof of the fake surgery claims, Linda's interference with Daniel's job prospects, and even messages between Linda and Megan planning how to siphon money from Ethan. But the most damning piece of evidence came from the USB drive. Daniel had secretly recorded a conversation between Megan and Linda. In it, Linda was coaching Megan on what to say to Ethan. Just tell him it's for Sophia's surgery, Linda said, her voice cold and calculating. He'll believe you. He's always been soft when it comes to family. What if Nina finds out? Megan asked. Linda laughed. Nina? What can she do? Ethan will always take our side. She's just the wife. Family comes first. I felt my hands tremble as I listened. This wasn't just manipulation, it was outright cruelty. Linda had no remorse for what she was doing. To her, we were nothing more than tools to be used and discarded. With this evidence, Ethan and I decided it was time to confront them. We planned a dinner at Linda's house, inviting Megan and Daniel as well. It was risky, but we knew we had to take control of the situation. The night of the dinner, Ethan and I arrived early. Linda greeted us with her usual sugary smile, but I could see the calculation in her eyes. So nice of you two to come, she said, her tone dripping with fake warmth. It's been too long. Megan and Daniel arrived a few minutes later, Sophia skipping happily beside them. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. Sophia was an innocent child in all of this, unaware of the chaos her family had created. But I reminded myself why we were there. This wasn't about Sophia. This was about the lies. Dinner started uneventfully, with Linda playing the perfect hostess, but I could feel the tension simmering beneath the surface. Finally, I couldn't hold back any longer. Linda, I said, setting my fork down, we need to talk about the money Ethan's been sending you and Megan. Her smile faltered for a fraction of a second before she recovered. Oh dear, whatever do you mean? Ethan's been so generous, helping his family in times of need. Helping? I repeated, my voice rising. You mean lying to him about Sophia's surgeries and draining our savings for your own gain? Megan's face turned pale, but Linda didn't miss a beat. Now, Nina, that's a serious accusation. Do you have any proofs? I smiled, pulling out the USB drive. As a matter of fact, I do. I plugged it into a laptop we'd brought with us, and the recording of Linda and Megan played for the entire room to hear. The color drained from Linda's face as her own words condemned her. How dare you record me? Linda snapped, her calm facade shattering. How dare you lie to us for years? I shot back. You've been manipulating Ethan, sabotaging Daniel, and stealing from us, all under the guise of family. Well, that ends now. Ethan spoke up, his voice steady but firm. Mom, you've taken advantage of me for the last time. I believed you, trusted you, and you used that trust to manipulate me. Nina and I have evidence of everything, and we're not going to let you get away with it. Megan started crying, but her tears didn't move me. You don't understand, she sobbed. We needed the money. Daniel wasn't working and Sophia. Don't you dare use Sophia as an excuse, I said, cutting her off. You've been exploiting her name to fund your lifestyle. Vacations, spa days, designer handbags. That's where the money went, isn't it? Megan looked down, unable to meet my eyes. Daniel spoke up, his voice quiet but firm. They're right, Megan. This has to stop. Sophia deserves better than this. Linda stood abruptly, her chair scraping against the floor. You ungrateful children, she hissed. After everything I've done for this family, this is how you repay me? What you've done, Ethan said, his voice trembling with anger, is tear this family apart. And now you're going to face the consequences. That night, we left Linda's house with the satisfaction of knowing we had exposed the truth. But the battle was far from over. Linda and Megan weren't going to back down easily. I could see it in Linda's eyes as we walked out the door. She was already plotting her next move. As Ethan and I drove home, I couldn't shake the feeling that the worst was yet to come. Linda wasn't just manipulative. She was dangerous. And if she thought she could still control Ethan, she was about to learn just how wrong she was.
I didn't sleep that night.
Even though we had confronted Linda and Megan and exposed their lies, I knew they weren't done. Linda's anger wasn't the kind that faded. It burned, vengeful and dangerous. I could feel it hanging in the air like a storm waiting to strike. The next morning, my fears were confirmed. Ethan received a frantic call from Megan. Mom took Sophia, she sobbed. She said she's protecting her, but I don't know where they've gone. I think she's planning something against you and Nina. Ethan and I exchanged a glance. We knew this wasn't about Sophia. Linda wasn't protecting her granddaughter. She was using her as a pawn, just as she had always done. This time, though, she had gone too far. We contacted Daniel immediately. He was furious, but not surprised. Linda's been threatening to take Sophia for months, he said. She thinks she owns us all.
We need to find her, I said.
Do you have any idea where she might go? Daniel hesitated, then nodded. There's a cabin. It's an old family property up by Lake Travis. Linda's kept it a secret for years, but Megan let it slip once. If she's hiding, that's where she'll be. Ethan and I didn't wait. We called Child Protective Services and the police, providing them with all the evidence we had gathered. While they mobilized, we drove to the cabin ourselves, unsure of what we'd find. When we arrived, the scene was eerily quiet. The cabin was tucked away in the woods, its windows glowing faintly in the fading afternoon light. We parked a short distance away and approached cautiously, unsure of what Linda might do if she saw us. Through the window, we saw Linda pacing the living room, her phone pressed to her ear. Sophia sat on the couch, clutching a stuffed animal, her face pale and scared. My heart ached for her, caught in the middle of this nightmare. As we debated our next move, Daniel arrived, his face set with determination. I'm not letting her get away with this, he said. He stepped forward, knocking firmly on the door. Linda opened it, her face twisting with anger when she saw him. What are you doing here? She snapped. I'm here for my daughter, Daniel said. You have no right to take her. I have every right, Linda hissed. You're an unfit father, and Ethan and Nina are dangerous. Someone has to protect Sophia. Ethan stepped forward, his voice calm but firm.
No, Mom. This ends now.
The police are on their way. You're not taking Sophia, and you're not manipulating us anymore. Linda's face darkened, but before she could respond, the sound of sirens broke the tense silence. Police cars pulled up to the cabin, their lights flashing. Officers quickly surrounded the property, and Linda's defiance crumbled. She was taken into custody, screaming accusations of betrayal and lies, but no one believed her anymore. Sophia ran into Daniel's arms, clinging to him tightly. Daddy, I was scared, she whispered. My throat tightened at her words, but I knew she was finally safe. Back home, the aftermath of Linda's arrest felt surreal. CPS awarded full custody of Sophia to Daniel, and Megan, shaken by everything, agreed to start therapy to break free from Linda's influence. Ethan and I worked to rebuild the trust that had been shattered, focusing on our future instead of the past. For the first time in years, it felt like we had control over our lives again. The lies, manipulation, and betrayal were behind us, and in their place, we found something stronger: truth, resilience, and the promise of a better tomorrow. My stepmom and stepsister secretly planned to kick me out of the house and take control of all my assets. They planted jewelry in my bag and accused me of stealing it. When I opened the bag, I was shocked to find the jewelry inside. My stepmom called the police, and I was arrested. They laughed, thinking they had won. But within 2 hours, they never expected the shocking surprise that awaited them. My name is Sophia, and my life changed forever 2 years ago. I used to think I knew what happiness felt like. Our home was warm, filled with love and laughter, and everything felt safe. That was when my mom was still alive. She was the glue that held our family together, the person who could make any bad day feel better with just a smile.
But then she got sick.
Cancer came into our lives like a thief, stealing her piece by piece until she was gone. I was only 17, and I felt like my world had collapsed. After she passed, everything started to fall apart. My dad, Mark, threw himself into work, trying to escape the grief, I guess. He barely spoke to me, and our house felt empty, like a shell of what it used to be. I tried to hold it together, but every day felt heavier than the last. For a year, I kept telling myself that things would get better, that Dad would come back to me, and we'd figure out how to move forward together. But instead, he came back with someone else.
Her name was Diana.
My dad introduced her as his new wife one night at dinner, like it was nothing. I didn't even know he was dating someone, let alone planning to remarry. She walked into our house with this air of authority, like She owned the place. And she didn't come alone. Her daughter, Ella, a year younger than me, followed her in with this smug little smirk that made my skin crawl. Sophia, my dad said that night, I know this is sudden, but I believe Diana and Ella will bring some happiness back into our lives. I need you to welcome them as part of our family. Part of our family? I didn't know how to respond. I felt like a stranger in my own home as Diana started making changes. She insisted that Ella and I share my room because it would help us bond. When I objected, my dad sided with her. It was like he'd stopped seeing me altogether and was now only focused on pleasing his new wife. The first few weeks were tense. Ella and I didn't get along. She acted like she owned the room and treated me like I didn't belong. I started noticing little things. How Diana always found ways to insert herself into Dad's decisions. How Ella would smile when Diana said something dismissive about me. It wasn't just annoying. It felt calculated. One day, while I was studying in the kitchen, I overheard them talking in low voices. They didn't know I was there. "We just need to be patient," Diana said. "Mark trusts me completely now. Soon, we'll have everything under control." I froze.
What were they talking about? Was it about me?
I couldn't ask Dad. He was so wrapped up in Diana's charm that I doubted he'd believe me. But I knew something wasn't right. Things escalated when Diana started commenting on my every move. "Sophia, don't you think you should help more around the house?" Or, "Sophia, your grades have been slipping lately. Are you even trying?" Ella joined in too, always with that smug smile. I felt like I was under constant surveillance. The turning point came when Diana accused me of stealing her jewelry. It was a Saturday morning, and I was in the living room when she stormed in, holding an empty jewelry box. "Sophia," she screamed. "My necklace is missing." I stood up confused. "What are you talking about?" "Don't play innocent," she said, her voice dripping with venom. "I know it was you. Ella saw you in my room yesterday." I looked at Ella, who was sitting on the couch with her phone, pretending to look concerned. "I didn't take anything," I said firmly. "Why would I?" Diana didn't answer. Instead, she grabbed my arm and dragged me to my room. Dad followed, looking confused but not defending me. "Open your bag," Diana demanded. I stared at her in disbelief. "Are you serious? You think I stole from you?" "If you didn't, you have nothing to hide," she shot back. Reluctantly, I unzipped my bag, and there it was, the necklace, buried under my clothes. My heart stopped. I knew it hadn't been there before. "See?" Diana said triumphantly. "I told you." I tried to explain, but no one listened. Dad just stood there, silent, as Diana called the police. Within an hour, I was sitting in the back of a squad car, humiliated and terrified. I kept telling the officers that I was innocent, that someone had set me up, but they only said, "We'll figure this out at the station." As I sat in that cold interrogation room, replaying everything in my mind, one thing became clear. Diana and Ella had planned this. They wanted me out of the house, and they were willing to do whatever it took to make it happen. That's when the investigator walked in. He introduced himself as Detective Carter, a man in his 50s with kind but sharp eyes. "Sophia," he said, sitting down across from me, "I want to hear your side of the story." And that's where everything began to change. I sat across from Detective Carter, my hands trembling slightly as I tried to steady my voice. "It wasn't me," I told him. "The necklace was planted in my bag. I don't know how, but Diana and Ella set me up. They've been trying to push me out of the house since they moved in." He leaned back in his chair, studying me with a quiet intensity. "Why would they do that?" he asked. I hesitated, unsure if he'd believe me. "Because they want control over the house, my dad, everything. I've seen the way Diana manipulates him. She's already convinced him to change so much, and now they want me gone." He didn't interrupt, just nodded for me to continue. So I told him everything, the comments, the smug smiles, the way Diana always seemed to twist things to make me look bad. By the time I finished, my throat was dry, and I was exhausted. I didn't know if I'd convinced him, but at least someone had finally listened. Detective Carter folded his hands. "Sophia, these are serious accusations. But I've been doing this job long enough to know when something doesn't add up. I'm going to dig into this, but you need to stay calm and cooperate. Do you understand? I nodded, relief washing over me. For the first time since this nightmare began, I felt like someone was on my side. The next day, I was released from custody while the investigation continued. My dad didn't pick me up. I had to take a cab home. When I walked through the front door, Diana and Ella were sitting in the living room, looking smug as ever. My dad stood nearby, his arms crossed and his face unreadable. "Sophia," Diana said with an icy smile, "we're glad you're home. But you need to understand how serious this is. We've decided it's best if you stay in your room while we figure out the next steps." Figure out the next steps? I snapped. You mean while you try to convince Dad to kick me out? Enough, Sophia. My dad barked, his voice sharper than I'd ever heard. You've already caused enough trouble. Don't make this worse.
His words hit me like a slap.
I wanted to scream, to make him see what was really happening, but I could tell it was useless. Diana had him completely under her spell. I stormed upstairs, slamming my door behind me. My room felt like a prison, and I could barely breathe. But as I sat there, something inside me shifted. I wasn't going to let them win. They thought they'd broken me, but they didn't know what I was capable of. The next few days were tense. I stayed in my room as much as possible, avoiding Diana and Ella. Meanwhile, Detective Carter started digging. He called me a few times, asking for more details about Diana and Ella, and I answered as best I could. Then, one evening, he showed up at our house unannounced. I was in my room when I heard the doorbell ring. Curious, I crept to the top of the stairs, just out of sight, and listened. "Mrs. Hayes," Carter said, his voice calm but firm, "I'd like to ask you and your daughter a few questions about the missing necklace." "Of course," Diana replied smoothly. "Anything we can do to help." "Great," Carter said. "Can we talk in the living room?" They moved out of sight, and I strained to hear. For the next 30 minutes, I caught bits and pieces of their conversation. Carter asked about the day of the alleged theft, their relationship with me, and their lives before moving in. Diana's answers were polished and rehearsed, but I noticed something. Ella was unusually quiet. After Carter left, Diana and Ella had a hushed argument in the kitchen. I couldn't make out what they were saying, but Ella's voice was high-pitched and anxious. Something was unraveling, and I knew it was only a matter of time. The next day, Carter called me. "Sophia, I think you were right," he said. "We've found some interesting information on Diana and Ella's past. Can you come down to the station tomorrow?" When I arrived, he showed me the file. It was filled with records, court documents, old police reports, even news clippings. Diana had a history of fraud, and Ella had been involved in a shoplifting ring a few years ago. "This paints a very different picture of them," Carter said. "And I found evidence that the necklace was planted in your bag. We're building a case against them, but we need a little more." He asked if I could stay alert and let him know if I noticed anything suspicious. I agreed, though the idea of being in the same house as them made my stomach turn. That night, I overheard them arguing again. Diana's voice was sharp. "You were supposed to keep your mouth shut," she hissed. I didn't say anything. Ella shot back. "But what if they figured out?" My heart raced as I recorded the exchange on my phone. It wasn't much, but it was something. I sent it to Carter immediately. The tension in the house was unbearable over the next few days. Diana and Ella seemed more on edge, and my dad was oblivious to it all. I kept my head down, waiting for Carter to make his move. Finally, one morning the doorbell rang again. This time, it wasn't just Carter, it was 2 uniformed officers. Diana and Ella were taken into custody, their protests ringing through the house. My dad looked stunned, his face pale as he watched his wife and stepdaughter being led away. "What's going on?" he asked Carter, his voice shaking. "Mr. Hayes," Carter said gently, "we have evidence that Diana and Ella framed Sophia for theft. There's also a history of criminal activity in Diana's past that you should be aware of." My dad turned to me, his eyes filled with guilt and pain. "Sophia, I had no idea. Maybe you should have listened to me," I said quietly, my voice trembling. As Diana and Ella were driven away, I felt a mix of relief and anger. Justice was being served, but the damage they'd done couldn't be undone. Watching Diana and Ella being taken away in handcuffs should have felt like a victory. But as the police car disappeared down the street, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt numb. My dad, Mark, stood frozen by the door, his face pale and drawn. For the first time, the reality of what had been happening finally hit him. And me? I wasn't sure if I wanted to yell at him or collapse into tears. He turned to me, his voice trembling. "Sophia, I don't know what to say. Maybe you could start with an apology," I said quietly, not trusting myself to say more. I walked past him and went to my room, shutting the door behind me. The house was eerily quiet for the rest of the day. I stayed in my room, replaying everything in my mind, the accusations, the betrayal, the lies. I thought about my mom and how different things might have been if she were still here. Would my dad have seen through Diana sooner? Would he have protected me? It was a spiral I couldn't stop, and by the time the sun set, I was exhausted. The next morning, my dad knocked on my door. When I didn't answer, he opened it and stepped inside. "Sophia," he began, his voice heavy with regret, "I know I failed you. I should have seen what was happening. I should have listened to you." I didn't look at him.
Why didn't you?
"Why did you trust them over me?" He sighed, sitting down on the edge of my bed. "After your mom died, I didn't know how to handle things. I felt lost, and when Diana came into my life, she seemed like the answer. She was supportive, confident, everything I thought I needed. I didn't realize. I didn't see what she was doing." I turned to him then, tears in my eyes.
You didn't just fail me, Dad.
"You chose her. You let her destroy everything." He looked like he wanted to say something, but instead he nodded. "You're right. I did. And I'll spend the rest of my life making it up to you if you'll let me." I didn't know if I could forgive him, but I could see the sincerity in his eyes. For now, that had to be enough. Over the next few weeks, the case against Diana and Ella unfolded. Detective Carter kept me updated, and it was like peeling back the layers of a rotten onion. Diana had been married twice before, and in both cases, she'd used manipulation to gain control of her husband's assets. Ella had been her accomplice, helping her scheme and cover her tracks. Together, they'd orchestrated a plan to push me out of the house, hoping to gain full control over my dad's business and finances. The evidence was overwhelming. Bank records, text messages, and the recording I'd made of their argument all painted a clear picture of their guilt. When the trial began, I was called to testify. It was one of the hardest things I'd ever done, sitting in that courtroom, facing the people who had tried to ruin my life. Diana's cold glare never left me, but Ella wouldn't meet my eyes. I think she knew they'd lost. The judge didn't need much convincing. Diana and Ella were both convicted of conspiracy and fraud. Diana received a lengthy prison sentence, while Ella, being younger and less involved in the financial crimes, was sent to a rehabilitation program. It was over. They couldn't hurt me anymore. Back at home, things were different. My dad was really trying to repair our relationship. He apologized every day, not just with words but with actions. He started spending more time with me, asking about my life, and making an effort to understand how I felt. It wasn't perfect, but it was a start. One evening, as we sat on the couch watching an old movie my mom used to love, he turned to me and said, "I filed for divorce from Diana today." I looked at him, surprised. "You did?" He nodded. "There's no fixing what she did. And honestly, I don't want to. I just want to focus on us now, on rebuilding what I broke." For the first time in a long time, I felt a flicker of hope. "I'd like that," I said softly. We spent the next few weeks clearing out the house, getting rid of anything that reminded us of Diana and Ella. It was like shedding old skin, letting go of the weight of their presence. Bit by bit, the house started to feel like home again. But even with Diana and Ella gone, the scars they left behind didn't fade overnight. I had nightmares sometimes, waking up in a cold sweat with the memory of that humiliating arrest playing in my mind. My dad would come to my room, sitting with me until I calmed down. "I'm here," he'd say. I'm not going anywhere. And slowly, I started to believe him. Things weren't perfect, but for the first time in years, I felt like I could breathe. I'd survived the betrayal, the lies, and the pain. And now I had the chance to rebuild, not just with my dad, but with myself. The hardest part of my story wasn't exposing Diana and Ella or clearing my name. It was learning to trust again, to let go of the anger and move forward. But I was getting there, one step at a time. It's strange how life can change so much in just a few months. For a long time, I felt like I was stuck in the middle of a nightmare I couldn't wake up from. But now, as I sit here telling this story, it feels like I've finally stepped into the light. The worst is behind me, and for the first time in years, I can see a future worth building. After Diana and Ella were out of our lives, things started to shift. My dad was different, not perfect, but better. He was present in a way he hadn't been since my mom passed. It wasn't easy for him to face what had happened. He carried so much guilt for trusting the wrong people and for failing to protect me when I needed him most. But he didn't run from it. Instead, he used it as a reason to be better. One evening, about a month after Diana's trial, my dad sat me down at the kitchen table. There was a stack of papers in front of him. "Sophia," he said, his voice steady but serious, "I want to show you something." He slid the papers toward me, and I saw that they were legal documents. "These are the changes I've made to my will and the business," he explained. "I've made sure that everything is secure and you're the primary beneficiary. No one will ever be able to take that away from you again." I stared at the documents, a lump forming in my throat. "You didn't have to do this," I said softly.
I did, he replied.
"I need you to know that I'll never let anyone hurt you like that again. This is my way of making sure you're protected, no matter what." For the first time in a long time, I felt safe. It wasn't just about the money or the house. It was about knowing my dad was on my side again. We were rebuilding the bond Diana and Ella had tried so hard to break. One afternoon, I decided to visit Detective Carter at the precinct to thank him for everything he'd done. Without him, I don't know where I'd be.
He smiled when he saw me.
"Sophia," he said, "I was hoping I'd hear from you."
"How are things?"
"Better," I said, honestly. "A lot better, thanks to you." He waved me off. "I just did my job. You're the one who stayed strong through it all. That takes real courage." His words stuck with me. For so long, I'd felt like a victim, powerless against Diana and Ella's schemes. But now, I realized I was stronger than I'd given myself credit for. I'd faced betrayal, humiliation, and heartbreak, and I'd come out the other side. That was something no one could take away from me. As life settled back into a new normal, I started thinking about my mom more often. Losing her had been the catalyst for so much pain, but her memory was also a source of strength. I began visiting her favorite spots around Seattle. Our favorite cafe, the park where we used to picnic, even the little bookstore where she'd buy me novels when I was a kid. Being in those places helped me feel closer to her, like she was still guiding me somehow. One day, while sorting through some old boxes in the attic, I found a photo album I hadn't seen in years. It was filled with pictures of my mom and me, laughing, baking, playing board games. There was one photo in particular that caught my eye. It was a picture of the two of us sitting on the porch, her arm around me, both of us grinning like we didn't have a care in the world. I framed that photo and put it on my nightstand. It reminded me of who I was before everything fell apart and who I could be again. It's been a year now since Diana and Ella were arrested. My dad and I are closer than we've ever been. We've made it a point to spend time together, whether it's cooking dinner, watching old movies, or just sitting on the porch talking about life. He's made mistakes, but he's working every day to make up for them, and I respect him for that. As for me, I've started taking classes at a local college. I'm studying psychology because I want to help people who've been through what I have, people who felt powerless and alone but don't know how to fight back. My experiences have given me a purpose, and that's something Diana and Ella can never take from me. Sometimes I think about them, where they are, what they're doing. I wonder if they regret what they did, or if they're still blaming everyone but themselves. But then I remind myself that it doesn't matter. Their story is no longer part of mine. Looking back, I realized that betrayal doesn't have to define you. It can shape you, yes, but it doesn't have to break you. I've learned that revenge isn't about hurting the people who hurt you. It's about rising above them, proving that they didn't win. And that's exactly what I've done. This is my story, but it's also my beginning. I'm no longer the scared girl who is framed and forgotten. I'm Sophia, and I've taken my life back. My wealthy parents left my sister an $80 million estate and gave me an old, dusty workshop. She mocked me, calling me a loser, but little did she know that junk would change everything. When I stepped inside the workshop, I stumbled upon a hidden safe. What I found inside left me speechless. It was worth 10 times more than her inheritance. The real shock: my sister tried to take it from me. But what happened a few days later, no one could have predicted. My name is Rebecca Miller, and I never thought I'd be standing where I am today, looking back at how everything started. If someone had told me that my biggest betrayal would lead to my greatest success, I would have laughed in disbelief. But life has a funny way of taking you places you never expected. It all began on a cold Tuesday morning in January, a few weeks after my parents' tragic plane crash. The loss itself was shattering. They were my world, even if they didn't always see me the way I wanted them to. My parents, William and Clara Miller, were wealthy, powerful, and well-respected in New York City. My dad built a fortune in real estate development, and my mom was a philanthropist with a talent for managing investments. Together, they had built a legacy worth millions, $80 million to be exact. But their wealth had always cast a long shadow over my life, one I could never seem to step out of. When the time came for the reading of the will, I knew I wasn't the favored child. My older sister, Sophia, had always been their golden girl. She's the type of person who can walk into a room and command everyone's attention. Glamorous, confident, and utterly ruthless. She's 35 now, but even growing up, Sophia was the one who always got everything right, at least in my parents' eyes. I, on the other hand, was the quiet one, the dreamer. I had always been interested in computers and technology, and while I had a decent career in software development, it was nothing compared to Sophia's flashy lifestyle. She managed the family's assets like a pro, or so everyone thought. The will reading took place in Mr. Carter's office. He was our family lawyer, a stiff, formal man in his 60s with a habit of adjusting his glasses every 5 seconds. The room felt suffocating, filled with mahogany furniture and the tension that comes when money is involved. Sophia sat next to me, dressed in a designer black dress and dripping in gold jewelry. Aunt Victoria, my dad's older sister, was also there, frowning like she always did when she looked at me. Mr. Carter cleared his throat and began reading the will. "To my beloved daughter Sophia," he said, "we leave the family penthouse in Manhattan, our investment portfolio, and all liquid assets." I watched as Sophia's lips curled into a triumphant smile. Of course, she got everything. I sat there, trying to prepare myself for whatever scraps might be left for me. "And to Rebecca," Mr. Carter continued, glancing at me over his glasses, "we leave the Miller workshop in Cleveland, Ohio." The silence that followed was deafening. The workshop? I hadn't thought about it in years. It was a small property my grandpa had owned, a place he tinkered with his inventions. It had been abandoned for decades. My dad always dismissed it as a useless, dusty relic of grandpa's eccentricity. And now, that was my inheritance? A forgotten building in Cleveland? Sophia burst out laughing. "The workshop? Oh, that's perfect," she said, her voice dripping with sarcasm. Little Becky always liked playing with computers in Grandpa's workshop. Now she gets to live her childhood dream, surrounded by junk. Aunt Victoria chimed in. "There must be a mistake, Mr. Carter. William and Clara would never leave Rebecca with just that." But Mr. Carter shook his head. "The will is quite clear. The workshop, including all contents and property, belongs solely to Rebecca." I couldn't move. I couldn't even speak. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I'd lost my parents, and now I was being handed a property everyone saw as worthless. Meanwhile, Sophia was practically swimming in wealth. "Don't worry, Becky," Sophia said as she stood to leave. "If you ever need help paying the bills, I'm sure we can arrange something." Her words stung like a slap, and her smirk stayed with me long after she walked out of the room. That night, I sat in my tiny Brooklyn apartment, staring at the manila envelope Mr. Carter had handed me. Inside was the deed to the workshop and a single key. I thought about tossing it all in the trash, but something stopped me. Memories of my grandfather filled my mind, his kind eyes, his patient voice as he explained his inventions to me, and the way he always said, "Rebecca, you see what others miss. That's your gift." The next morning, I booked a one-way ticket to Cleveland. When I arrived, the workshop was even worse than I'd imagined. The building was old, with peeling paint and broken windows. Dust coated every surface, and the air smelled like rust and oil. I felt a pang of despair as I stood there, wondering why my parents would leave me this place. But as I walked through the workshop, I couldn't help but feel a strange connection. This was where Grandpa had spent his last years, working tirelessly on projects no one else understood. I noticed a wall at the back of the workshop that didn't seem right. The measurements didn't line up with the rest of the building. I remembered something Grandpa used to say when I was little. "Always look closer, Rebecca. There's more to see than what's on the surface." My heart started racing as I ran my fingers along the wall, searching for something, anything. And then I found it. A panel that moved when I pressed it.
Click.
The wall swung open. Behind it was a hidden room, filled with blueprints, prototypes, and a locked safe. My breath caught in my throat. What was all this? Why had Grandpa hidden it? And more importantly, why had he left it for me? I had no idea what I was about to uncover, but one thing was certain. This workshop wasn't as worthless as everyone thought. I couldn't sleep that night. My mind was buzzing with questions and possibilities. What had Grandpa been working on? Why did he hide it? And why had he left it to me, of all people? As I stood in that hidden room, surrounded by his blueprints and prototypes, I realized that this wasn't just a forgotten space. It was a treasure chest, waiting to be opened. The first thing I noticed was the safe in the corner. It was an old-fashioned combination lock, the kind you'd expect to see in a movie. My fingers hesitated over the dial as I thought back to Grandpa. He'd always had a soft spot for me, even when no one else seemed to care. Then it hit me, my birthday. Grandpa never forgot it, even in his later years. I turned the dial, entering the numbers carefully.
Click.
The door swung open. Inside the safe was a leather-bound notebook and a small hard drive. I sat down on the dusty floor, holding the notebook like it was the most precious thing in the world. On the first page, written in Grandpa's unmistakable handwriting, were the words, "To Rebecca, the only one who ever truly listened." I felt a lump in my throat as I turned the pages. The notebook was filled with sketches, equations, and notes about an invention I could barely begin to understand. It was some sort of artificial intelligence system, far beyond anything I'd seen before. Grandpa had developed a way to integrate machine learning with environmental sustainability. He called it Project Aurora. His notes detailed how this AI could revolutionize robotics, making them smarter, faster, and more eco-friendly. It wasn't just groundbreaking, it was years ahead of its time. The hard drive contained even more. Blueprints for prototypes, simulation data, and patent drafts that Grandpa had written but never filed. As I stared at the screen of my laptop, scrolling through his meticulous work, a sense of awe washed over me. This wasn't the work of a man who had lost his mind, as my father used to say. This was the work of a genius. But as the excitement grew, so did the fear. If Sophia or Aunt Victoria found out about this, they'd stop at nothing to take it from me. I knew how they operated. Sophia would hire the best lawyers, spin some story about how Grandpa's inventions should belong to the family estate. Aunt Victoria would back her up, using every ounce of her cunning to undermine me. I couldn't let that happen. Grandpa trusted me with this for a reason, and I wasn't going to let them destroy his legacy. I spent the next few weeks cleaning up the workshop, transforming it from a forgotten relic into a functional space. It wasn't easy. The roof leaked, the wiring was ancient, and the entire place looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. But with every nail I hammered and every shelf I dusted, I felt closer to Grandpa. This was his space, and now it was mine. Once the workshop was ready, I started assembling a team. I knew I couldn't do this alone. The first person I called was Dr. Allen, a robotics engineer I'd met at a tech conference years ago. Back then, we'd bonded over our shared frustration with corporate greed and the lack of innovation in the industry. If anyone could help me bring Project Aurora to life, it was him. "Rebecca? Is that you?" he said when he answered the phone. "Yeah, it's me," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "I need your help, Alan. It's big." There was a pause on the other end of the line. "How big?" "Big enough that it could change everything," I said. "But I need you to keep this absolutely confidential. No one can know, not yet." He agreed to meet me at the workshop the following week. When he arrived, his jaw practically hit the floor. "Rebecca," he said, staring at the blueprints spread across the table. "Do you have any idea what this is?" "That's what I was hoping you could tell me," I said with a small smile. Dr. Allen spent hours going through Grandpa's notes, muttering to himself and occasionally letting out an excited laugh. "This isn't just a breakthrough," he finally said, looking at me with wide eyes. "This is revolutionary. Your grandfather was light years ahead of his time. If we can get this working, well, let's just say the robotics industry will never be the same." Hearing those words lit a fire inside me. For so long, I'd felt like the family failure, the one who never quite measured up. But now, I had something they couldn't take away from me, something they couldn't dismiss. The next step was funding. I used my savings from years of working in software development to cover the basics, but I knew I'd need more if we were going to build the prototypes and file the patents. That's when I reached out to a few trusted friends in the tech industry. They believed in me when no one else did, and with their support, I was able to secure enough funding to get started. But I didn't stop there. I knew I had to protect Project Aurora from prying eyes. I set up a series of shell companies to keep my name off the radar. If anyone, including Sophia, tried to dig into what I was doing, all they'd find were dead ends. As the weeks turned into months, the workshop came alive. Dr. Allen brought in a small team of engineers, each of them carefully vetted for their discretion and expertise. The blueprints on Grandpa's hard drive became real, tangible prototypes. Every time I saw a robot arm move or a line of code come to life, I felt like I was honoring Grandpa's memory. But the closer we got to success, the more I felt the weight of what was at stake. Sophia's birthday was coming up, and I knew the whole family would be there. Part of me wanted to stay away, to keep my head down and focus on the work. But another part of me, the part that still remembered every cruel comment, every dismissive laugh, wanted to see her face when she realized what I was building. Little did I know, that birthday party would set everything into motion. I didn't want to go to Sophia's birthday party. The idea of sitting through another evening of her flaunting her wealth and achievements, while everyone else pretended she was the pinnacle of perfection, made my stomach turn. But something inside me told me I had to go. Maybe it was a small, petty part of me that wanted to see her face when she realized I wasn't the failure she thought I was. Or maybe it was just curiosity. Either way, I found myself standing in front of the grand ballroom of a luxury hotel in Manhattan, dressed in a simple navy dress I'd borrowed from a friend. The party was as over-the-top as I expected. Chandeliers glittered from the ceiling, a string quartet played softly in the corner, and waiters in crisp white shirts carried trays of champagne. Sophia was at the center of it all, wearing a custom gown that probably cost more than my annual rent. Her husband, Mark, a venture capitalist, was glued to her side, laughing at whatever she said like it was the funniest thing he'd ever heard. When Sophia spotted me, her eyes lit up with mock surprise. "Rebecca," she exclaimed, crossing the room to greet me. "I didn't think you'd come. What was it again?" "Oh, right, the workshop. Still digging through Grandpa's junk." I forced a smile. "It's actually been quite educational," I replied, keeping my tone light. "You'd be surprised at what I've found." Sophia raised an eyebrow, clearly unimpressed. "Well, if you need help selling it off, Mark knows a guy who specializes in old properties. Just let us know." I bit my tongue, resisting the urge to snap back. Let her think what she wants, I told myself. She'd find out soon enough. As the night went on, I kept my distance, sipping champagne and watching the room. It was the same crowd as always, wealthy, arrogant, and utterly oblivious to anyone outside their bubble. Aunt Victoria eventually cornered me, her sharp eyes scanning me like I was some sort of anomaly. "Rebecca," she said, her voice dripping with condescension, "what are you working on these days? I heard you're still tinkering with Grandpa's little workshop. Shouldn't you be focusing on something more practical?" I met her gaze evenly. "Actually, I'm working on something that could be quite impactful," I said. "But I can't share the details yet. It's confidential." Aunt Victoria smirked. "Confidential? That's an interesting word for it." I didn't bother responding. She wasn't worth the energy. It wasn't until later in the evening that I decided to drop a small hint. Sophia was holding court near the dessert table, surrounded by her usual entourage. I walked over, casually joining the conversation. "Sophia," I said, cutting into whatever story she was telling, "how's the tech sector of your portfolio doing these days? I heard there's been some buzz about shortages in advanced robotics components. Must be tough for investors." Her smile faltered for a split second, just long enough for me to notice. "Oh, it's fine," she said dismissively. "I haven't really been keeping track." "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, hiding my grin behind a sip of champagne. "No reason. Just curious. You might want to look into it, though. Things are changing quickly." I didn't stay much longer after that. The party was exhausting, and I had more important things to focus on. But as I left the hotel, I couldn't help but feel a spark of satisfaction. Sophia might not have understood what I was doing, but she could tell there was more to it than I was letting on. That was enough for now. The next morning, while Sophia and Mark were probably jetting off to some tropical island for a post-party vacation, we broke ground on our first official project. Dr. Allen and his team had been working tirelessly to finalize the prototype, and we were ready to move forward. The plan was simple: test the technology, secure partnerships, and file the patents before anyone could catch wind of what we were doing. It wasn't long before the first headlines appeared. "Revolutionary AI technology disrupts robotics industry." The article detailed our advancements, calling it a game changer for manufacturing, automation, and environmental sustainability. I felt a surge of pride as I read it, knowing that we had finally brought Grandpa's vision to life. But the celebration was short-lived. Within days, my phone started ringing off the hook. Aunt Victoria, Sophia, and even Mark were calling, leaving message after message. They'd seen the article, and now they wanted answers. "Rebecca," Sophia's voice said on one of the voicemails, her usual confidence replaced with a hint of desperation. "Why didn't you tell us about this? We're family. We could have helped." Helped? The same way they'd helped by mocking me and dismissing everything I'd ever tried to do? I didn't respond. I wasn't ready to face them yet. Instead, I focused on securing the next steps. Contracts with major robotics firms were finalized, and investors were lining up to get a piece of what we were building. Our valuation skyrocketed, and within a matter of months, Miller AI Innovations was worth over $2 billion. Grandpa's dream was finally becoming a reality. But I knew it wasn't over. Sophia and Aunt Victoria weren't the type to back down easily. They'd come for me, sooner or later. And when they did, I'd be ready. I knew it was only a matter of time before Sophia and Aunt Victoria confronted me. The article in the press had shaken them, and the realization that I'd built something extraordinary without their help or knowledge must have felt like a slap in the face. I didn't answer their calls or messages. I was too busy solidifying everything Grandpa and I had worked for. But when Aunt Victoria insisted on an emergency family meeting, I decided it was time to face them. The meeting was held at the family's old Manhattan penthouse, the same one Sophia now lived in. Walking through those doors felt surreal. The place was as opulent as ever, with its marble floors and crystal chandeliers, but it no longer felt like home. It was a monument to everything I'd left behind. Sophia was waiting in the living room, dressed impeccably as always, but there was tension in her posture. Aunt Victoria sat next to her, a legal pad in hand, her face a mask of sharp determination. Mark was there too, leaning against the fireplace, arms crossed. It was like walking into a courtroom, and I was the one on trial. "Rebecca," Sophia began, forcing a smile. "Thank you for coming. We've been trying to reach you." "I noticed," I said evenly, sitting down on one of the plush armchairs. "What's this about?" Sophia's smile wavered. "It's about the technology you've been working on. The company. We feel." "We?" I interrupted, raising an eyebrow. "Yes, we," Aunt Victoria cut in, her tone clipped. "We feel that Grandpa's inventions and anything developed from them should rightfully belong to the family estate. He created those ideas while he was still a part of this family, and they're a shared legacy." I stared at her, trying to suppress my anger. "You mean the same legacy that you and Sophia dismissed as junk? The same workshop you mocked me for inheriting?" Sophia shifted uncomfortably. "We didn't know what was in there. If we had, things would have been different." "Exactly," Aunt Victoria said, seizing the opening. "You've been withholding valuable assets from the family, Rebecca. That's unethical and possibly illegal." I couldn't help but laugh. "Unethical? You're accusing me of being unethical? You two have spent your entire lives chasing wealth without a second thought for the people you trample along the way. And now that I've built something on my own, you think you can swoop in and take it?" "It's not about taking it," Sophia said quickly. "It's about fairness. Dad would have wanted us to share in this. We're family, Rebecca." That word, family, hit me harder than it should have. I'd spent years trying to prove my worth to them, trying to belong in a family that had always treated me like an outsider. But not anymore. I pulled Grandpa's notebook out of my bag and placed it on the coffee table. "Do you know what this is?" I asked, my voice calm but firm. Sophia and Aunt Victoria leaned forward, their eyes fixed on the notebook. "It's Grandpa's journal," I continued. "Every idea, every blueprint, every prototype, it's all here. He left it for me."
Not you.
"Not the estate."
Me.
"Because he believed in me when no one else did." I flipped to a marked page and read aloud. "To Rebecca, you're the only one who ever truly listened. You saw value where others saw waste, and that's why I'm leaving this to you. I know you'll make something of it." I looked up, meeting their stunned faces. This was his choice, not mine. Sophia's composure cracked, and she leaned forward, her voice desperate. "Rebecca, we can still work something out. We can be partners. We can—" "No," I said sharply, cutting her off. "We can't. I gave you a chance to believe in me, and you chose to mock me instead. You're only here now because you see dollar signs, not because you care about Grandpa's legacy or me." Aunt Victoria tried to interject, but I held up a hand. "And don't think I haven't prepared for this," I added, my voice steely. "Grandpa's will explicitly states that everything in the workshop belongs to me, including the intellectual property. I've already filed the patents, and I've made sure they're ironclad. Legally, there's nothing you can do." The room fell silent. Sophia looked like she wanted to argue, but she knew I was right. Mark avoided my gaze, clearly uncomfortable with the tension. I stood up, picking up the notebook. "You always told me I was the disappointment of the family," I said, looking directly at Sophia. "But the truth is, I'm the one who saw value where you saw nothing. And now, I'm the one who's built something real. Something that matters." As I walked to the door, Aunt Victoria called after me. "Your parents would be ashamed of how selfish you're being." I paused, turning back to face them. "No," I said quietly. "They'd be ashamed they never saw what Grandpa saw in me. And that's their loss, just like this is yours." Today, Miller AI Innovations is worth over $4 billion. We've partnered with some of the biggest names in technology, and our advancements in robotics are shaping the future. The workshop in Cleveland has been transformed into a state-of-the-art facility, but I kept Grandpa's hidden room exactly as it was, a reminder of where it all began. As for Sophia and Aunt Victoria, they've tried to reconcile a few times, usually when they need something. I don't hold any grudges, but I also don't let them back into my life. Instead, I've focused on using my success to help others, creating opportunities for people like me, people who were overlooked, underestimated, and dismissed. They say revenge is sweet, but I've learned something even sweeter, proving that true worth isn't in what you inherit, but in what you create. And that, more than anything, is the legacy Grandpa wanted me to carry forward. My young boss fired me before my contract ended and said I'd be replaced. He cut off all my benefits and gave me just $30 as a pension. Before leaving, I deleted the company's entire software system. The next morning, chaos took over. The employees stopped him at the door and handed him their resignation letters. Panicked and desperate, he called me for help. I laugh because my name is Sarah Williams. I'm 45 now, but I've spent the last 25 years of my life devoted to one company, a place I thought would be my second home forever. I joined right after graduating from college, full of hope and ambition. At that time, the company was still small, more of a startup really, and it was led by Michael Benson, a man whose wisdom and kindness left a mark on everyone he met. I was a shy, awkward young woman back then, far more comfortable around computers than people. Technology was my escape. I spent hours tinkering with code, building software systems, and finding solutions to problems most people didn't even know existed. It was Michael who recognized my potential when I applied for the position of a junior programmer. He told me, "Sarah, I see something special in you. I think you'll do great things here." From the very beginning, Michael treated me with respect and encouragement. He wasn't just a boss, he was a mentor. Under his guidance, I thrived. I worked tirelessly, building the company's core software systems from scratch. The systems I created weren't just functional, they became the backbone of the company's operations. Every department from sales to logistics depended on them, and Michael never failed to acknowledge my contributions. That meant the world to me. One thing I'll never forget is the unique contract Michael offered me when I started. It included a clause that allowed me to retain ownership of the software I developed. He explained it as a way to safeguard my work and ensure fairness. At the time, I thought it was just a formality, but as the years passed, that clause became more significant than I ever imagined. The company grew rapidly over the years, expanding to new markets and hiring more employees. With every success, I felt a sense of pride. I wasn't just an employee, I was part of something meaningful. Michael's leadership style made everyone feel valued. He believed in building a company that cared for its people, and he practiced what he preached. Bonuses, promotions, and recognition were given based on merit, and there was a sense of unity among the staff. However, life has a way of throwing unexpected challenges our way. A few years ago, Michael's health began to decline. It started with small things, missed meetings, unexplained fatigue. But soon it became clear that his condition was serious. He was diagnosed with a chronic illness, one that required long-term treatment and frequent hospital visits. The news shook the entire company. While Michael tried to stay involved, he eventually had to step down from his role as president. His son, Andrew Benson, took over. I had met Andrew a few times before. He was charming, confident, and full of bold ideas. At first, I believed he could carry on his father's legacy. He even gave a rousing speech during his inauguration, promising to honor his father's vision while bringing in fresh energy. I wanted to trust him. After all, he was Michael's son. But Andrew's leadership was nothing like his father's. He was focused on efficiency and profitability above all else, and he wasn't shy about making drastic changes to achieve his goals. The first few months of his presidency were filled with optimism, but it didn't take long for the cracks to show. Andrew began implementing cost-cutting measures that disrupted the company's harmony. Long-standing employees were reassigned to roles they weren't suited for, and younger, less experienced workers were promoted to key positions. His reasoning was simple. He wanted a modern, fast-paced company led by fresh minds. The changes didn't sit well with me, but I told myself it wasn't my place to judge. I continued doing my job, ensuring the systems ran smoothly despite the chaos around me. It wasn't easy. Talented colleagues, many of whom I had worked with for decades, started resigning one by one. They felt undervalued, cast aside in favor of Andrew's vision. Each departure felt like losing a piece of the company's soul. Still, I stayed. I told myself I had a responsibility to the company, to the systems I had built, and to the remaining employees who depended on them. But deep down, I couldn't shake the feeling that the company I once loved was slipping away. The camaraderie, the mutual respect, and the sense of belonging, all of it was fading. I remember one conversation with David Carter, a bright and ambitious IT specialist I had been mentoring. "Sarah," he said one day, "what's happening to this place? It doesn't feel the same anymore." I nodded, understanding his frustration. "I know, David. But we can't lose hope. This company has been through tough times before. We just have to keep doing our best." David sighed. "It's hard to stay optimistic when good people are being pushed out. I don't want to end up like them." His words stayed with me. I couldn't promise him things would get better because I wasn't sure myself. But I knew one thing. I wasn't ready to give up. I had dedicated 25 years to this company, and I wasn't about to let Andrew Benson ruin everything Michael had built. Looking back, I wonder if I should have seen the signs earlier. Andrew's focus on short-term gains was a stark contrast to his father's long-term vision. The tension in the office was palpable, and morale was at an all-time low. It was only a matter of time before things came to a head. And they did, but not in the way I expected. Things began to spiral out of control after Andrew's first year as president. His focus on cost-cutting had turned ruthless. Departments were slashed to skeleton crews, and anyone who wasn't seen as essential was reassigned or let go. But it wasn't just the layoffs that hurt, it was the way Andrew treated people. He saw long-serving employees like me as relics of the past, obstacles to the modern company he envisioned. At first, I tried to stay out of his way. I kept my head down and focused on my work, making sure the systems I had spent years developing continued to run smoothly. But Andrew's changes began to affect even my department. He started questioning the necessity of the systems I had built, arguing that newer, cheaper software might be more efficient. I tried to explain the risks of replacing a well-integrated system, but he wouldn't listen. One day, Andrew called me into his office for a meeting. I could tell right away it wasn't going to be good news. He sat behind his massive desk, a smug smile on his face, and gestured for me to sit. "Sarah," he began, "I've been looking over the budget and I noticed your department is one of the most expensive in the company. Do you think that's sustainable?" I frowned, unsure how to respond. "The systems I manage are critical to the company's operations," I said carefully. "They handle everything from inventory tracking to customer orders. If those systems fail..." Andrew waved a hand dismissively. "I understand that, but don't you think we could achieve the same results with a less expensive solution? Maybe something off the shelf?" I couldn't believe what I was hearing. Off-the-shelf systems wouldn't be tailored to our needs. They could cause significant downtime during the transition, and we'd lose the custom features that have helped us stay competitive. Andrew leaned back in his chair, his smile fading. "Look, Sarah, I appreciate your loyalty, but times are changing. We need to adapt." I left that meeting feeling uneasy. For the first time, I realized that my position and everything I had built for the company was at risk. It wasn't just about the systems. It was about the culture of respect and teamwork that Michael had fostered. Andrew was tearing it all apart. The breaking point came a few weeks later. Andrew called me into his office again, this time with an envelope in hand. He handed it to me with a practiced air of formality. "Sarah," he said, after careful consideration, "we've decided to let you go. Your last day will be at the end of this month." For a moment, I just stared at him, unable to process his words. "You're letting me go?" I finally managed to say. "After 25 years?" Andrew shrugged. "It's not personal. It's just business. Your pension is outlined in the contract you signed when you joined the company." I opened the envelope and found a check inside, along with a note stating my pension amount. My heart sank as I read the figure. $30. I looked up at Andrew, stunned. "This can't be right," I said, my voice shaking. "This isn't what I agreed to." Andrew smirked, clearly enjoying my reaction. "It's all in the contract. Take another look." He slid a copy of my original employment contract across the desk, pointing to a handwritten note next to the section about the pension. It read, "Pension, $30, in writing that wasn't part of the original text. I felt a wave of anger and betrayal. This wasn't just a mistake, it was deliberate. I stood up, clutching the envelope. "You can't do this," I said, my voice rising. This company wouldn't exist without the systems I built. Without me. Andrew leaned forward, his smirk widening. I think you're overestimating your importance, Sarah. The company will be fine without you. I left his office in a daze, my mind racing. How could he do this? How could he reduce my years of dedication to a mere $30? But as the shock wore off, I felt something else. Determination. If Andrew thought he could erase my contributions so easily, he was about to learn just how wrong he was. I went straight to the IT department, where David was waiting. He could tell something was wrong as soon as he saw my face. What happened? He asked, concern in his voice. I handed him the envelope and explained everything. When I finished, he was furious. This is unbelievable, he said. After everything you've done for this company. I nodded. I know. But there's something he's forgotten. David frowned. What do you mean? I pulled out a copy of my employment contract, pointing to the clause that Michael had included all those years ago. The systems I built don't belong to the company. They belong to me. And if I leave, the systems go with me. David's eyes widened as he realized what I was saying. Are you sure about this, Sarah? I nodded. I've never been more sure of anything. If Andrew wants to play dirty, I'm not going down without a fight. Over the next few days, David and I worked quietly, dismantling the systems piece by piece. It wasn't easy. Those systems were like my children, and taking them apart felt like tearing out a piece of myself. But I knew it was the only way to make Andrew understand the value of what he had so carelessly discarded. On my last day, I handed him my keys and walked out of the office for the final time. By the end of the afternoon, the systems were offline and chaos erupted. Phones were ringing off the hook, emails weren't being sent, and entire departments were paralyzed. I could hear the panic in their voices as I walked away. Sarah, David said as we left the building together, do you think he'll realize what he's done? I looked back at the office, where Andrew's arrogance had led him to this moment.
He'll realize, I said.
And when he does, he'll have no choice but to face the consequences. The morning after my departure, I woke up to a flood of missed calls and messages. Most of them were from Andrew Benson himself, his tone shifting from demanding to desperate. I ignored them all, sipping my coffee as I scrolled through the news. It didn't take long for the story to make headlines. Local company faces system failure. Operations halted. For a moment, I felt a pang of guilt. I wasn't the kind of person who enjoyed watching others suffer, even someone like Andrew. But I reminded myself of what he had done, reducing my decades of loyalty to a meaningless sum, mocking my contributions, and discarding me without a second thought. If he wanted to learn the value of what I had built, this was the only way. David texted me a few hours later. They're in complete chaos. Phones aren't working, emails aren't going through, and they've lost access to customer records. I couldn't help but smile. Andrew had underestimated me, but now he was facing the full consequences of his arrogance. Later that day, Andrew finally got through to me. I hesitated before answering, but curiosity won out. Sarah, he said, his voice tense. What have you done? I followed the contract, I replied calmly. You wanted me gone and the systems went with me. It's all perfectly legal. You can't do this, he snapped. The entire company is paralyzed. Do you have any idea what this is costing us? I do, I said, my tone icy. And maybe now you'll understand the cost of undervaluing your employees. There was a long silence on the other end. When Andrew spoke again, his voice was quieter, almost pleading. Look, Sarah, I made a mistake. Let's work something out. Name your price, and we'll pay you to bring the systems back online. For a moment, I considered his offer. It would be easy to take the money and walk away, but I knew that wouldn't solve the deeper issue. Andrew would go right back to his destructive ways, and the company would continue to crumble. No, I needed to take this further. My price, I said. $1 million. What? Andrew exploded. That's outrageous. There's no way we can pay you that much. Then good luck rebuilding the systems from scratch, I said. You'll spend far more than $1 million in time and resources. You're insane, he shouted before hanging up. I set my phone down, feeling a mix of satisfaction and nervous energy. I knew Andrew wouldn't give in easily, but I also knew he had no choice. The company's survival depended on the systems I had built, and without them, his leadership would be exposed as the disaster it truly was. Over the next few days, the chaos only grew worse. Departments were scrambling to find workarounds, employees were overwhelmed, and customers were furious. Andrew's supporters, who had once praised his visionary leadership, were now questioning his competence. David kept me updated on the situation. "They're running out of options," he said during one of our calls. Even Andrew's most loyal allies are starting to turn against him.
Good, I said.
It's about time someone held him accountable. But the real turning point came when Michael Benson returned to the office. I hadn't spoken to him since my dismissal, but I knew he wouldn't stay on the sidelines once he realized what was happening. Despite his poor health, Michael's presence was commanding. He called an emergency board meeting to address the crisis, and from what David told me, it was a sight to behold. "Andrew," Michael said during the meeting, his voice steady despite his illness. "You've made a mess of everything I built. You've disrespected loyal employees, driven away talent, and now you've crippled the company by ignoring Sarah's warnings. This stops now." Andrew tried to defend himself, blaming the system failure on me. But Michael wasn't having it. "Don't you dare shift the blame," he said. "Sarah gave this company 25 years of her life. She built the systems that kept us running, and you treated her like she was disposable. This is your fault, Andrew, and you need to take responsibility." By the end of the meeting, the board had made their decision. Andrew was to be demoted to an entry-level position. It was a humiliating blow for him, but it was the only way to salvage what was left of the company. Later that evening, I got a call from Michael. "Sarah," he said, his voice warm and familiar. "I owe you an apology. I should have stepped in sooner." "You have nothing to apologize for," I said. "I'm just glad you're back." "I need your help," he continued. "The board wants you to return as Chief Operating Officer. You're the only person who can restore what Andrew destroyed." For a moment, I was speechless. Coup? It was an incredible opportunity, but I wasn't sure if I was ready to step into such a high-profile role. "Think about it," Michael said. "The company needs you, Sarah. And I can't think of anyone better for the job." I promised him I would consider it, but deep down, I already knew my answer. This was my chance to rebuild the company I had loved, to create a workplace where people like me would be valued. It wouldn't be easy, but I was ready for the challenge. After Michael's call, I spent the night reflecting. Becoming the Chief Operating Officer would be a tremendous responsibility, but it also felt like the natural culmination of everything I had worked for. This wasn't just about systems or titles. It was about preserving the legacy of a company that once stood for fairness, innovation, and integrity. The next morning, I called Michael. "I'm in," I told him. "But on one condition. Andrew can't interfere." "You have my word," Michael said. "He'll be starting over as an entry-level employee, and he'll report to you. He needs to understand what it means to truly build something." With that assurance, I stepped back into the company I had left behind. Walking through the office, I was met with mixed reactions. Some people looked relieved, others surprised, and a few avoided eye contact altogether. But what struck me most was the quiet sense of hope beginning to stir. My return wasn't just about fixing the systems. It was about rebuilding trust. The first order of business was restoring the software systems. David and I dove back into the work we knew best, reconstructing the systems piece by piece. It was a massive undertaking, but with the experience we had, it didn't take long to get the company back on its feet. By the end of the week, operations were running smoothly again, and the sense of relief was palpable. "David," I said as we wrapped up the final stages of the restoration, "I couldn't have done this without you." He smiled, a little embarrassed. "I'm just glad to be part of the solution." "You're more than that," I said. "You've shown incredible loyalty and resourcefulness through all of this. I want to make sure that doesn't go unnoticed." As the systems came back online, so did morale. Employees who had been on the verge of burnout began to find their rhythm again. I made it a point to walk the floors, listening to concerns, and reconnecting with old colleagues. Many of them shared their frustrations with Andrew's leadership and their hopes for a better future under Michael's guidance, and To my surprise, mine. One afternoon, Michael called me into his office. "Sarah," he said, "the board is impressed with how quickly you've turned things around. They want to formalize your role as COO at the next shareholder meeting." The weight of his words hit me. Chief Operating Officer. It felt surreal, but I also knew I was ready. Michael leaned back in his chair, a warm smile on his face. "You've earned this, Sarah." And I couldn't be prouder. As for Andrew, his demotion was as humbling as it was necessary. Watching him adjust to life as an entry-level employee was an experience I never expected to witness. He struggled at first, frustrated by the lack of authority and the mundane tasks he was assigned. But over time, I began to notice subtle changes. He was listening more, asking questions, and even seeking advice from his peers. Whether it was genuine growth or simply survival, I couldn't say. But I hoped that, in some small way, he was learning what it meant to truly contribute. Months passed and the company began to stabilize. We hired back some of the talented employees who had left during Andrew's tenure, offering them roles that matched their skills and experience. I worked closely with Michael and the board to implement policies that prioritized fairness and growth, ensuring that no one else would face the kind of dismissal I had endured. David, meanwhile, continued to shine. His dedication and expertise earned him a promotion to IT director, a role I knew he was more than capable of handling. "You deserve this," I told him during his first day in the new position. "And I can't wait to see what you'll achieve." He grinned. "I've had a great mentor." One day, as I was leaving the office, I ran into Andrew. He looked different, more grounded, less self-assured. He hesitated before speaking. "Sarah," he said, "I just wanted to say,
I'm sorry."
For everything." I studied him for a moment, trying to gauge his sincerity. There was no trace of the arrogance that had defined him before. "Thank you," I said simply. "I hope you've learned something from all this." "I have," he said, his voice quiet. "More than I ever thought I needed to." The shareholder meeting where my role as COO was finalized felt like the start of a new chapter, not just for me, but for the entire company. As I stood before the board, presenting our vision for the future, I felt a sense of pride I hadn't felt in years. This wasn't just about titles or power. It was about rebuilding a culture of respect, innovation, and resilience. When the meeting ended, Michael pulled me aside. "You've done something remarkable, Sarah," he said. "This company wouldn't have survived without you." "It wasn't just me," I replied. "It was everyone who believed in what this place could be, including you." Looking back now, I realize how far I've come, not just as an employee but as a person. The journey wasn't easy, and there were moments when I wanted to give up. But in the end, standing up for what I believed in was worth it. The company is stronger now, not just because of the systems or policies, but because of the people who make it what it is. As I walk through the office each day, I see a team that's united, a workplace that's thriving, and a future that feels bright. And I know, without a doubt, that this is exactly where I'm meant to be. On my 23rd birthday, when I introduced my fiancé, my cruel stepmom stood up and shouted, "How dare you choose your life partner, a beggar? Leave him immediately." I refused and said, "I will choose my life partner. It's my life." Furious, she slapped me hard and ordered security to throw me out of the event. But nobody could have predicted how the next 2 hours would turn the event completely upside down. My name is Dorothy Carter, and for as long as I can remember, my life has been a script written by someone else. That someone is my stepmother, Stephanie Carter. She's always been the one in charge, not just of the house, but of our lives, our choices, and every step we were allowed to take. My father, Thomas, never objected. He stood by her, silent and complicit, letting her rule over everything. Growing up in Austin, Texas, I lived in a house that was more like a museum than a home. It was pristine, grand, and suffocating all at once. Stephanie's influence was everywhere, from the perfectly coordinated furniture to the way we were told to behave at the dinner table. Nothing was ever truly ours. It was all a reflection of her power. When my mother passed away when I was 6, Stephanie entered our lives. At first, she seemed kind, almost warm, as if she was trying to fill the void left behind. But it didn't take long for her true nature to show. She demanded perfection, and she expected loyalty. Absolute, unquestioning loyalty. She made sure that every decision I made was one she approved of, from what I wore to which friends I was allowed to see. My opinions? They didn't matter. By the time I was a teenager, I had learned to keep my head down. It was easier to comply than to fight. My father always told me, "Stephanie knows what's best for us." Even when I wanted to scream, I stayed silent. But that silence came at a cost. Slowly, I felt myself slipping away, losing the person I was meant to be. It wasn't until my 23rd birthday that everything changed. Stephanie decided to throw a grand party, her version of a celebration. The guest list was full of people I barely knew, business associates, high society friends, and anyone who could enhance her reputation. The decorations were over the top, the kind of extravagance that screamed wealth and status. It was her show like everything else in our lives. But I had plans of my own that night. I had been keeping a secret, one that I knew would turn her carefully curated world upside down. Ethan Blake, my fiancé. Ethan wasn't part of Stephanie's elite circle. He wasn't wealthy or influential. He was just a hardworking small business owner who cared about me for who I was, not for what I represented. I had kept our relationship hidden, knowing Stephanie would never approve. But I was done hiding. This was my life, and it was time to take control. When the moment came, I stood in the middle of the room, surrounded by guests sipping champagne and making polite conversation. My heart was racing, but I knew I couldn't back down. I called for everyone's attention, and as the room fell silent, I introduced Ethan. "This is Ethan Blake," I said, my voice steady despite the tension. "My fiancé." The room erupted into whispers and gasps, but none of that mattered. All I could focus on was Stephanie's face. Her expression shifted from confusion to fury in an instant. She stepped forward, her voice cutting through the noise like a knife. "What did you just say?" she demanded. "I'm engaged to Ethan," I replied, meeting her gaze. "And we're getting married." Her laugh was cold and sharp, the kind of laugh that made my stomach churn. "How dare you make this decision without consulting me? Do you have any idea how this makes our family look?" I clenched my fists, my voice rising with every word. "This isn't about our family's image.
This is about me.
My life. And I will choose my partner." Stephanie's face twisted in anger. "You idiot," she spat. "How dare you talk back to me like this?" Before I could react, her hand came down hard across my face. The room fell silent as a sharp gasp escaped from the crowd. My cheek stung, but the pain was nothing compared to the humiliation. She turned to the security guard stationed at the entrance, her voice cold and commanding. "Get her out of here."
Now?
I stood frozen as the guards approached, but I didn't move. I wouldn't give her the satisfaction of seeing me crumble. Then I looked at my father, hoping, praying, that he would step in. But he didn't. He just stood there, his face pale, his hands clenched at his sides. He said nothing. My heart broke in that moment. The man who was supposed to protect me, who should have stood by me, was siding with her. As the guards grabbed my arms and led me toward the door, I saw my uncle, Lucas, stepping forward. He pushed through the crowd, his voice firm. "Stop. She's coming with me." Stephanie glared at him, but Lucas didn't back down. He took my arm and led me out of the house. As we walked to his car, I felt a mix of relief and despair. I had lost my family, or at least the illusion of one, but I wasn't alone. When we reached Lucas's house, he handed me a cup of tea and sat beside me. "Dorothy," he said, his voice gentle but firm, "you don't have to face this alone. I'm here for you." Tears filled my eyes as I nodded. For the first time in years, I felt a glimmer of hope. I didn't know what would come next, but one thing was certain. I was done being controlled. This was the beginning of a new chapter, and I was ready to fight for the life I deserved. After the chaos of that night, I moved into my Uncle Lucas's modest but warm home in a quieter part of Austin. It wasn't grand or lavish like the Carter estate, but it felt more like home than anywhere I'd lived in years. For the first time, I was free from Stephanie's suffocating control. But the sting of betrayal lingered. especially for my father. He had chosen her, yet again, over his own daughter. That wound would take a long time to heal, if it ever did. Lucas was my anchor during those initial weeks. He didn't push me to talk, but when I finally poured out my heart, he listened patiently. "I can't just let her get away with this," I said one evening as we sat in his living room. "She's ruined everything. She treats us like puppets, and my father, he just lets her." Lucas nodded thoughtfully. "You don't have to let this go, Dorothy. If you want justice, you have every right to fight for it. But be smart about it. Stephanie is powerful. She won't go down easily." That conversation planted a seed in my mind. Stephanie had built her life on control, manipulation, and appearances. What if those appearances weren't as flawless as she wanted everyone to believe? I needed to know what she was hiding. A few days later, I reached out to James Miller, a private investigator Lucas had recommended. When James arrived at the coffee shop where we'd agreed to meet, he seemed unassuming, average height, slightly graying hair, with a no-nonsense demeanor. "I've heard about your stepmother," he said after I explained the situation. "People like her rarely keep their hands clean. Let me do some digging." It felt surreal, hiring someone to investigate my own family. But this wasn't just about me anymore. Stephanie had hurt too many people, and I wasn't going to let her continue unchecked. The days that followed were a blur of anticipation and anxiety. I threw myself into helping Lucas around the house, trying to keep my mind off the investigation. Ethan, my fiancé, was my rock during this time. He didn't blame me for what had happened at the party, though I had worried he might feel overwhelmed by all the drama. Instead, he stood by me, reassuring me with his steady presence. "I can't believe she did that to you," Ethan said one evening as we sat on Lucas's porch. "But I'm proud of you for standing up to her." "I just hope it was worth it," I said softly. "She's not the kind of person who lets things go." Ethan took my hand. "Whatever happens, we'll face it together." A week later, James called me. "Dorothy, I think you'll want to see what I've found," he said, his voice calm but charged with urgency. We met at his office the next morning, and he laid out a file on the desk between us. As he began to speak, my stomach twisted. "Stephanie Carter isn't who she pretends to be," James began. "On the surface, she's a socialite and a philanthropist, but underneath, well, it's a different story." He detailed everything he had uncovered: shady business dealings, secret offshore accounts, and most shockingly, her connection to a local criminal gang involved in money laundering. "She's been funneling money through fake charities and using her influence to cover it up," James explained. "I've got the evidence to prove it." I stared at the file, my mind racing. It was worse than I had imagined. Stephanie wasn't just manipulative, she was dangerous. "This could ruin her," I said, my voice trembling with a mix of fear and determination. James nodded. "It will, if you're ready to take it public. But be prepared. This won't be easy. She'll fight back." I knew he was right, but the thought of Stephanie finally facing consequences for her actions was too powerful to ignore. I thanked James and left his office, the weight of the evidence heavy in my hands. As I walked back to Lucas's house, my resolve hardened. Stephanie had built her empire on lies, and it was time for those lies to come crashing down. That evening, I sat with Lucas and Ethan, sharing what James had uncovered. "You're sure about this?" Lucas asked, his expression a mix of concern and pride.
"I'm sure," I replied.
"She's hurt too many people, and she needs to be stopped." Ethan squeezed my hand. "We'll stand by you no matter what." With their support, I contacted a lawyer the next day. The evidence James had gathered was damning, and together, we filed a case against Stephanie. The legal process began to unfold, and as the days turned into weeks, I felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. This was the fight of my life, and I wasn't backing down. But Stephanie wasn't idle during this time. I started receiving veiled threats, anonymous phone calls, and messages meant to scare me into dropping the case. One night, a rock was thrown through Lucas's front window, shattering the glass and leaving us shaken. "She's trying to intimidate you," Lucas said, his voice firm. "Don't let her win." "I won't," I replied, though my hands trembled as I cleaned up the shards of glass. Ethan insisted on staying with us after that, and James helped us increase security around the house. Despite the fear, I refused to give up. This wasn't just about me anymore. Stephanie's actions had hurt countless others, and it was time for her reign of terror to end. As the court date loomed closer, I found myself standing taller, speaking with more confidence. For the first time, I felt like I was reclaiming my voice. Stephanie had underestimated me, and she was about to learn that I wasn't the frightened girl she thought she could control. The night before the trial, Ethan took my hands in his and said, "No matter what happens tomorrow, I'm proud of you. You've already won by standing up for yourself." His words filled me with strength. Tomorrow, the truth would come out, and Stephanie Carter's world would never be the same. The courtroom was packed. Reporters with cameras hovered outside, eager to catch every detail of what was shaping up to be the scandal of the year in Austin. Inside, the atmosphere buzzed with tension. I sat beside my lawyer, my palms damp and my heart pounding. Across the room sat Stephanie, composed as ever, her icy demeanor betraying no hint of fear. But I knew better. She was a woman who thrived on control, and today, that control was slipping. The trial began with the prosecution laying out the evidence James Miller had uncovered. They detailed Stephanie's elaborate money laundering schemes and her connection to a local criminal gang. Each revelation felt like a blow against the carefully constructed image she had maintained for years. The courtroom listened in stunned silence as records of offshore accounts, forged documents, and testimonies from former associates were presented. Stephanie's lawyer tried to discredit the evidence, but it was a losing battle. The facts were undeniable. When James took the stand as a witness, his testimony was clear and methodical. He explained how he had traced funds through fake charities and connected this to Stephanie's illegal operations. I watched her face closely, searching for cracks in her mask. There it was, a flicker of panic in her eyes when James mentioned a wire transfer to one of the gang leaders. She was cornered, and she knew it. When it was my turn to testify, my stomach churned. I stood, took a deep breath, and told the truth. I described my life under Stephanie's control, how she manipulated everyone around her, and how she had humiliated me in front of the world at my own birthday party. I recounted the investigation and the threats I had received. I wanted the court to understand that this wasn't just about me. It was about everyone Stephanie had exploited and hurt. She used her influence to silence anyone who got in her way, I said, my voice steady despite the lump in my throat. She believed she was untouchable. But no one should have that kind of power. As I spoke, I felt a strange mix of emotions, fear, anger, and finally, a sense of liberation. For so long, Stephanie's voice had drowned out my own, but not anymore. I was finally being heard. The turning point came when a former associate of Stephanie's testified against her. He was part of the criminal gang and had struck a deal with the prosecution for a reduced sentence. His testimony was the final nail in her coffin. He confirmed everything James had uncovered and revealed even more, Stephanie's involvement in blackmail and intimidation tactics to keep her operations hidden. The courtroom was silent as his words sank in. Stephanie's lawyer sat motionless, knowing there was no way to spin this. For the first time, Stephanie looked truly shaken. Her composure cracked, and I saw the fear she had tried so hard to hide. When the judge delivered the verdict, guilty on multiple counts of money laundering, fraud, and criminal conspiracy, I felt an overwhelming sense of relief. Stephanie was sentenced to several years in prison. The woman who had controlled every aspect of my life was finally facing justice. As the court session ended, my father approached me. He looked older, more fragile, as if the weight of the truth had aged him overnight. "Dorothy," he began, his voice trembling. I didn't know. If I had known." I cut him off, my tone firm but not unkind.
"You chose to stand by her, Dad. Even when you saw how she treated me, you did nothing." He looked down, guilt etched into his features. I was weak. I let her control me too. But I see now what I've lost, and I'm so sorry. His apology came too late. For years, I had waited for him to protect me, to stand up for me. But he never did. I couldn't forget that. I can't do this, Dad, I said, shaking my head. I can't forgive you, not now. He nodded, tears in his eyes. I understand, he said softly before walking away, his shoulders slumped. For the first time, I saw him as he was, not the strong father I had once believed in, but a man broken by his own choices. As I left the courthouse with Ethan and Lucas by my side, I felt a mix of emotions: sadness for the family I had lost, pride in the fight I had won, and hope for the future I was building. Stephanie's reign of terror was over, but my journey wasn't finished yet. There was still so much ahead: my wedding, my life with Ethan, and the freedom to live on my own terms. That day, I walked out of the courthouse not as Dorothy Carter, the controlled and silent stepdaughter, but as Dorothy, a woman who had fought for justice and reclaimed her voice. The days after the trial were a whirlwind of emotions. Stephanie was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, and her empire crumbled in the aftermath. News of her conviction spread quickly, and her name became synonymous with greed and corruption. Watching her fall from grace should have felt like a triumph, but instead, I felt an odd mix of sadness and relief. She had shaped so much of my life, albeit in all the wrong ways, and now she was finally out of it. My father, Thomas, filed for divorce shortly after the trial. He tried to reconcile with me, showing up unannounced at Lucas's house one afternoon. "Dorothy," he began, his voice filled with regret. "I've lost everything, your mother, Stephanie, and now you. Please let me make things right." I looked at him, searching for the man I had once idolized. But all I saw was someone who had stood idly by while Stephanie destroyed everything. "Dad," I said, my voice calm but firm, "it's too late. You had years to stand up for me and you didn't. I can't trust you now." He nodded slowly, his face crumpling with sorrow. "I understand," he said softly. "I just hope that someday you'll find it in your heart to forgive me." As he walked away, I felt a sense of finality. It was painful, but it was necessary. My father had made his choices, and now I had to make mine. And my choice was to move forward without him. Ethan and I decided to move to Dallas, leaving the shadow of Austin behind us. With Lucas's help, we found a cozy apartment in a vibrant neighborhood. It wasn't grand, but it was ours, a place where we could start fresh and build a life together. Planning our wedding became a joyful distraction. We kept it simple and intimate, inviting only close friends and family. Lucas walked me down the aisle, his face beaming with pride. As I stood across from Ethan, holding his hands, I felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. He had stood by me through the darkest times, and now we were stepping into the light together. "I promise to stand by you, always," Ethan said during his vows, his voice steady and full of love. "To support you in your dreams, to celebrate your victories, and to face every challenge by your side." Tears welled in my eyes as I replied, "And I promise to do the same. To love you for who you are, to cherish our life together, and to never let anyone take away our happiness." As we exchanged rings and kissed, I felt a weight lift off my shoulders. For the first time in years, I wasn't thinking about Stephanie or my father. I was thinking about us, about the future we were creating. Life in Dallas was everything I had hoped for. I threw myself into my new job at a nonprofit organization, helping underserved communities access education and resources. It was work that made me feel fulfilled, like I was making a real difference. Ethan continued to run his small business, pouring his heart into every project. We found joy in the little things: lazy Sunday mornings, exploring the city, and dreaming about what was next. But moving on wasn't always easy. Nightmares of the slap, the threats, and the betrayal still haunted me at times. Ethan encouraged me to talk to a therapist, and for the first time, I allowed myself to process everything I had been through. The sessions were hard, forcing me to confront the pain I had buried for years, but they were healing. Slowly, the nightmares faded, replaced by a sense of peace. One evening, Ethan showed me a news clip on his phone. Stephanie had given an interview from prison, claiming she had been misunderstood and blaming others for her downfall. I watched for a moment before turning away. She's still trying to control the narrative,
I said, shaking my head. Ethan nodded. But the world knows the truth now. She can't hurt you anymore.
And he was right.
Stephanie's reign over my life was truly over. 3 years after the trial, I returned to Austin for the first time. A charity gala was being held in Lucas's honor, and I wanted to be there to support him. Walking into the grand venue, I felt a flicker of unease, memories of the past threatening to resurface. But then I saw Lucas's face, full of pride and warmth, and I knew I had made the right choice. To my surprise, my father was there. He approached me hesitantly, his eyes searching mine. "Dorothy," he said softly, "I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I wanted to say I'm proud of you. You've become everything I wasn't brave enough to be." I didn't respond immediately, letting his words sink in. Finally, I nodded. "Thank you," I said simply, and we parted ways without further conversation. It wasn't reconciliation, but it was closure. As Ethan and I drove back to Dallas that night, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't known in years. The scars of the past would always be there, but they no longer defined me. I had fought for my freedom, my happiness, and my future, and I had won. This was my story. Not one of defeat, but of resilience. Of finding justice and building a life worth living. And as I looked at Ethan, his hand resting gently on mine, I knew the best chapters were still to come. On my first wedding anniversary, my sister-in-law stormed in with a stunning, wealthy woman by her side, smirking as she declared, "Meet my brother's new wife." My world shattered as my unfaithful husband turned to me and sneered, "You poor, useless girl. You're nothing." Before I could react, he ordered the security guards to drag me out onto the freezing street. I sobbed, humiliated and abandoned, but as they celebrated inside, they had no clue the storm this new wife was about to unleash on them. By the next morning, their perfect world would begin to crumble. I always believed my life was on the right path. My name is Helen Green, and until recently I was living a dream, or so I thought. Let me take you back to where it all began. I was 29 years old, living in my family's home in suburban Chicago. It wasn't just a house. It was a symbol of everything I held dear. My parents built it with love, and every corner of it held a memory. When they passed away, I inherited the house. It was my sanctuary, a reminder of their warmth and guidance. When I met Ryan Green, I thought I'd found someone who understood me, someone who shared my dreams of building a life filled with love and trust. He was charming in his mid-30s, with a smile that could light up a room. I fell hard and fast. Within a year, we were married, and I welcomed him into the house I treasured so much. In the beginning, life seemed perfect. Ryan was attentive and supportive, or at least he appeared to be. But looking back now, I realized there were cracks I chose to ignore. One of the first was his relationship with his sister, Jessica Moore. She was in her early 40s, confident and commanding. Ryan seemed to hang on her every word. At first, I thought it was endearing, a sibling bond that close. But soon, I started to notice how her opinions often overruled mine, even in matters that were deeply personal to me. Jessica wasn't just opinionated. She was controlling. She visited frequently, and every time she stepped into the house, I could feel her eyes scanning every inch of it. She made comments about how it was too much for someone like me to handle and how I should think about letting her and Ryan help manage it. I brushed it off as her way of being protective of her brother, but deep down, I felt uneasy. It was as if she was measuring the house up for herself. Ryan, on the other hand, always assured me that he was on my side. "Don't worry about Jessica," he would say. "She just likes to be involved." I wanted to believe him. I needed to believe him. After all, I loved him. But as the months went on, Jessica's interference only grew. She started questioning my decisions, from how I decorated the house to how I managed the bills. What hurt the most was how Ryan would sometimes side with her, brushing my concerns aside like they didn't matter. Still, I tried to keep the peace. I told myself that marriage was about compromise and understanding. When Ryan suggested we celebrate our first wedding anniversary with a grand dinner party, I jumped at the idea. It felt like a chance to show everyone, including Jessica, that we were a strong and happy couple. I spent weeks planning every detail. The guest list was perfect, the menu carefully curated, and the house looked stunning. On the evening of the party, I stood in the living room, watching the guests arrive, feeling a rare sense of pride. For once, it felt like everything was coming together. Ryan was by my side, charming as ever, entertaining our friends and family. Jessica arrived fashionably late, as she often did, with her usual air of superiority. She gave me a quick, dismissive hug and immediately began critiquing the decorations. "Well, this is quaint," she said with a smirk. I smiled tightly, refusing to let her ruin the evening. As the night went on, I started to relax. The guests seemed to be enjoying themselves, and Ryan was unusually attentive. I began to think that maybe, just maybe, Jessica had been a test of my patience and we were finally past it. But then, just as we were about to cut the anniversary cake, everything fell apart. Jessica stormed into the center of the room, her voice sharp and cutting. "Stop this ridiculous charade," she shouted, her eyes locking onto mine. The room fell silent, and I could feel everyone's eyes on me. My heart raced as confusion and fear bubbled up inside me. "You're nothing but a liar and a cheat," Jessica spat. "You've been deceiving this family from the start. Tell them, Helen, about your secret lawyer and your so-called boyfriend."
What?
I stammered, utterly blindsided. "That's not true."
What are you talking about?
Jessica's lips curled into a cold smile, and she turned to Ryan. "Well, are you going to let her keep fooling everyone?" Ryan, the man I had trusted with my heart, stepped forward. For a moment, I thought he might defend me, but instead, he said words I will never forget. "She's right. I've had enough of this. Helen, this ends tonight." Before I could even process his betrayal, Ryan gestured to a young woman standing quietly in the corner. "This is Lisa," he announced. "She's everything you're not. Wealthy, successful, and honest. From now on, I'm with her." My knees felt weak, but Ryan wasn't finished. "You're worthless, Helen. You don't belong here anymore." "Security," he called, and within moments, 2 men appeared to escort me out. I tried to protest, but no one listened. My world crumbled as I was forced out of the house I loved into the cold Chicago night. I stood on the icy sidewalk, tears streaming down my face, trying to understand how everything I had built had been ripped away in an instant. Little did I know, this was only the beginning of my fight to reclaim what was mine. The cold air that night seemed to pierce through every layer of my skin. I stood on the sidewalk outside the house that had been my sanctuary, now filled with laughter and celebration for a life I had just been cut out of. I felt utterly alone, the betrayal cutting deeper with every breath. Ryan's words, "You're worthless," played over and over in my head. My knees buckled, and I sat on the curb, trembling and crying. How could the man I loved, the man I trusted, do this to me? I don't know how long I sat there before I heard a car pull up. I looked up to see a familiar face stepping out of the driver's seat. "Helen," the man said cautiously, his voice warm but filled with concern. It took me a moment to place him. It was Ethan Cole, my college classmate. We had been close back then, but life had taken us in different directions. Seeing him now felt like a lifeline. "Ethan's?" I managed to whisper, barely able to speak through my tears. He knelt beside me, his eyes scanning my face. "What happened? Are you okay?" I couldn't hold back any longer. The whole story spilled out of me. The accusations, Ryan's betrayal, Jessica's scheming, and how they had taken over my home. Ethan listened intently, his expression shifting from concern to anger. When I finished, he gently helped me to my feet. "You can't stay out here," he said firmly. "Come on, let's get you somewhere warm." Ethan took me to his apartment on the other side of the city. It was modest but cozy, a stark contrast to the grand house I had been thrown out of. He handed me a blanket and made me a cup of tea, his movements calm and reassuring. "You're safe here," he said. "Take your time." As I sipped the tea, my mind raced. Everything had happened so fast, I could barely process it. The man I had loved and trusted had turned against me. His sister, who had been meddling in my life from the start, had orchestrated it all. And now, they were living in my home, celebrating their victory while I was left with nothing. "Ethan," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't know what to do. They've taken everything from me. That house, it's all I have left of my parents." He nodded, his jaw tight. "We're going to fix this, Helen. You're not alone in this." Ethan's words were like a spark of hope in the darkness. Over the next few days, he helped me piece together a plan. As a lawyer, he knew the importance of evidence, and he believed there was more to Jessica and Ryan's actions than just greed. "People like them don't just stop at one victim," he said. "We need to find out what they're hiding." Ethan hired a private investigator, a man named Tham Hastings. Tom was in his late 40s, gruff but efficient. "Don't worry," he said when we met. "I've handled cases like this before. If there's dirt to be found, I'll find it." While Tom worked on gathering evidence, Ethan helped me stay focused. He encouraged me to document everything I could remember about Ryan and Jessica's behavior, their finances, and their interactions with others. It was painful to relive the memories, but it also gave me a sense of purpose. For the first time since that awful night, I felt like I was taking control of my life again. It didn't take long for Tom to uncover some shocking truths. Jessica and Ryan weren't just manipulative, they were criminals. They had a history of targeting wealthy or financially independent women, gaining their trust and then stripping them of their assets. Tom found records of gambling debts, fraudulent business deals, and even false identities used to cover their tracks. The young woman Ryan had introduced at the party, Lisa, was their latest target. She was wealthy, yes, but she had no idea she was being used. Ethan was furious when he heard the details. "They've done this to other women," he said, his voice cold with anger. "And they thought they could get away with it again." As Tom dug deeper, he found concrete evidence linking Jessica and Ryan to multiple fraudulent activities. Bank records showed they had drained funds from previous victims to fuel their gambling habits. Fake documents revealed how they manipulated ownership of properties, including my house. It was all there in black and white. When Ethan showed me the files, my hands shook.
"This is it," he said.
"This is the proof we need to bring them down." Despite the overwhelming evidence, I felt a pang of fear. Taking legal action meant going up against the people who had already destroyed so much of my life. But Ethan was determined. "Helen, you deserve justice. They can't keep getting away with this." I nodded, trying to summon the courage I knew I would need. "Okay," I said. "Let's do it." The first step was filing a lawsuit. Ethan worked tirelessly, drafting the case and ensuring every detail was accounted for. The legal process was daunting, but with Ethan by my side, I felt a glimmer of hope. For the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to imagine a future where I reclaimed not just my house, but my life. As we prepared for court, the reality of what was at stake weighed heavily on me. But with Ethan's support and Tom's evidence, I began to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could win. The weeks leading up to the court case felt like a blur. I poured every ounce of strength I had into preparing for the fight ahead. Ethan was my rock during this time, working tirelessly to ensure our case was ironclad. I watched him draft documents late into the night, consult with experts, and strategize every possible angle. His determination inspired me, and for the first time since that awful night, I felt a sense of control returning to my life. I still remember the morning of the trial. My stomach was in knots, and my hands trembled as I got ready. Ethan noticed my unease. "You've got this, Helen," he said gently. "Remember, we have the truth on our side." As we arrived at the courthouse in downtown Chicago, I saw Ryan and Jessica waiting outside. Ryan looked smug, his arm draped around Lisa, the woman he had introduced as his new partner. Jessica's eyes locked onto mine with a cold, calculating stare. My heart raced, but I stood tall, refusing to let them see how much they had hurt me. When the trial began, the courtroom was filled with tension. Ethan presented our case with precision and clarity, laying out the evidence Tom had gathered. Bank records, fraudulent documents, and testimonies painted a damning picture of Ryan and Jessica's schemes. It was almost surreal hearing the details laid out so plainly, their gambling debts, their manipulation of women, and the lengths they had gone to seize control of my home. Jessica, true to form, tried to spin her own narrative when it was her turn to speak. "This is all a misunderstanding," she said with feigned innocence. "We only wanted to help Helen manage the property. She's always been emotional." Hearing her twist the truth made my blood boil, but Ethan was ready for her. He presented irrefutable evidence that tied her to the fraudulent activities, leaving no room for doubt. "Your help included forging documents to transfer ownership of Helen's home to yourself," Ethan said, his voice steady but sharp. "Do you deny this?" Jessica faltered, her confident facade cracking for the first time. Ryan, on the other hand, seemed less composed. As the evidence piled up, his smug demeanor faded. He shifted uncomfortably in his seat, avoiding eye contact with everyone in the room. One of the most pivotal moments came when Lisa, the woman Ryan had left me for, took the stand. To my surprise, she revealed that she had no idea about Ryan and Jessica's schemes. "I trusted him," she said, her voice shaking. "He told me Helen was unstable and that the house was his. I didn't know I was being used." Her testimony was powerful, and it exposed the depths of Ryan's deceit. I felt a mix of emotions, anger at how easily he had manipulated her, and gratitude that she had chosen to speak the truth. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Ryan and Jessica had no defense. The evidence was overwhelming, and their lies unraveled with each passing moment. The judge listened intently, his expression stern, as Ethan delivered his final argument. "This case is about more than fraud or theft," Ethan said, his voice steady and firm. "It's about justice for a woman who was betrayed by the very people she trusted most. Helen deserves to reclaim not just her property, but her dignity." When the judge finally announced the verdict, I held my breath. Based on the evidence presented, the court finds Ryan Green and Jessica Moore guilty of multiple charges, including fraud, theft, and conspiracy. Both are sentenced to 12 years in prison. The room erupted in murmurs, but I barely heard them. Tears streamed down my face as the weight of everything I had endured finally lifted. The judge continued, "Furthermore, the court orders the immediate return of Helen Green's property, as it was wrongfully taken." Ryan and Jessica were led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, their faces pale and defeated. For the first time, I felt a sense of vindication. They had tried to destroy me, but in the end, they had destroyed themselves. Outside the courthouse, Ethan turned to me, his expression a mix of relief and pride. "It's over," he said softly. "You did it, Helen." "No," I replied, smiling through my tears. "We did it." For the first time in months, I felt a sense of peace. My home was mine again, and the people who had tried to take everything from me were finally facing the consequences of their actions. But more than that, I had found strength I never knew I had. With Ethan by my side, I knew this was only the beginning of a new chapter, one where I was in control of my own life. When I stepped back into my house for the first time after the court's decision, it felt both familiar and strange. The walls still held the memories of my parents, the love and warmth they had given me, but it also bore the scars of betrayal. Standing there, I realized this house wasn't just a place, it was a symbol of everything I had fought for. I walked through each room, taking in the silence. The grandeur Jessica had tried to claim for herself and the life Ryan had flaunted with Lisa now seemed hollow. But to me, this house was alive again, filled with possibility. It was mine, not because of a court order, but because I had refused to let them take away my dignity. Ethan came by later that evening to check on me. He carried a box of pizza and a bottle of wine, grinning as he held them up. "I thought you could use a low-key celebration." We sat on the floor of the living room, eating and laughing. It felt good, simple and genuine, something I hadn't felt in so long. Ethan had been my anchor through all of this, but now I saw him in a different light. He wasn't just my lawyer or my friend. He was someone who had believed in me when I had nothing left, and that meant more than I could ever express. Over the next few weeks, I focused on reclaiming the house as my own. I repainted the walls, replaced furniture that held painful memories, and added little touches that reflected who I was. It felt like I was finally breathing life back into a home that had been dormant for too long. Each change I made was a step toward reclaiming myself. Ethan continued to be a constant presence in my life. Whether it was helping me choose colors for the living room or encouraging me to take time for myself, he was always there. And as the days turned into weeks, our bond grew stronger. It wasn't just his kindness or his unwavering support. It was the way he saw me, not as someone broken, but as someone strong and capable. One afternoon, as we sat in the backyard, the garden bathed in sunlight, Ethan turned to me. "Helen, I've been meaning to ask you something." I raised an eyebrow, curious. "What is it?" He hesitated, then smiled. "What do you want for your future?" "I mean, now that everything's settled, what do you see for yourself?" The question caught me off guard, but it made me realize something important. For so long, I had been fighting first to save my marriage, then to reclaim my home, and finally to rebuild my life. But now I had the freedom to choose what I wanted. And as I looked at Ethan, I realized he was a big part of that future. "I want to live a life that's mine," I said slowly. "One where I'm not afraid to trust, to love, and to dream. And I want to build it with people who make me feel like I'm enough." Ethan's expression softened, and he reached for my hand. "Then let's build it together." His words hung in the air, and for a moment, I felt the weight of everything we'd been through. But as I looked into his eyes, I knew it wasn't just about what we had overcome. It was about what we could create together. Months later, in a small ceremony surrounded by friends who had stood by us, Ethan and I exchanged vows. It wasn't grand or extravagant, but it was perfect. In that moment, I realized my journey wasn't just about reclaiming what had been taken from me. It was about finding something even better. Today, as I sit in the home I fought so hard for, I can finally say I'm at peace. The road to get here wasn't easy, but it taught me the power of resilience and the importance of standing up for yourself. Ryan and Jessica tried to break me, but instead, they made me stronger. And with Ethan by my side, I'm ready to embrace the future, whatever it may bring. On my wedding day, my father betrayed me, skipping my ceremony to celebrate my stepbrother's event instead. While I was left to cover all my wedding expenses, my stepmother secretly schemed to steal my $70 million inheritance for her son, with my father's full support. But they didn't see what was coming. By the next morning, as they woke up, they were blindsided by a revenge so shocking, it turned their world upside down. My name's Dorothy, and I've always been someone who believed in family. I used to think my dad was my hero, a man who could do no wrong. Growing up in Austin, Texas, I had a happy childhood. My parents, Richard and Clara, were loving and supportive, and life was simple. My dad taught me how to ride a bike, cheered me on at school recitals, and made sure I felt special in every way. But things changed when I was 14. I still remember the day my parents sat me down in our cozy living room to tell me they were getting a divorce. My mom had discovered my dad was having an affair. The woman's name was Sarah, and she worked in real estate. I didn't know how to feel. My world shattered that day, and I clung to my mom as we moved out of the house. I thought maybe my dad and I could still be close, but that was wishful thinking. 6 months after the divorce, Dad married Sarah. I tried to be open-minded, I really did. Sarah seemed nice at first. She had a son, Liam, who was just a couple of years younger than me. At 28 now, he's an aspiring musician, but back then, he was just the new kid in my life. I thought maybe we could bond as a family, but it didn't take long for Sarah's true colors to show. Sarah was always controlling. She made decisions about everything in my dad's life, including me. I went from being the center of his world to feeling like an afterthought. I noticed it in small ways at first. He'd miss our movie nights because Sarah needed him to do something. Then it became bigger things, like skipping my birthday dinner to attend Liam's baseball game. I told myself it was temporary, that he'd remember I was his daughter. But as the years went by, it only got worse. By the time I was 18, it was clear that Sarah had all but replaced me in my father's life. Dad would shower Liam with gifts and attention, and Sarah encouraged it. Liam wanted to be a musician, and my dad spent thousands of dollars on lessons, equipment, and studio time for him. Meanwhile, I worked part-time jobs to save for college. I didn't mind working hard for what I wanted, but it hurt knowing my dad wouldn't help me the same way he helped Liam. I thought things might improve when I graduated college and started working as a marketing manager at a local firm. I even hoped Dad might finally notice the woman I had become. But when I introduced him to Jake, the love of my life, it was like he barely cared. Jake is an architect, smart and kind, and everything I'd ever wanted in a partner. My dad gave him a polite handshake and quickly changed the subject to talk about Liam's latest performance. Then came the wedding planning. Jake proposed to me on a beautiful spring morning during a hike, and I couldn't have been happier. We set the date for October 15th and started making arrangements. We sent out invitations 6 months in advance so everyone could plan, including Dad and Sarah. I even hoped this could be a chance to reconnect with my father. But that hope was short-lived. 2 months before the wedding, I found out that Liam had scheduled his music debut on the exact same day. It wasn't just a coincidence. He had known our wedding date. When I confronted my dad about it, I'll never forget his words. Liam's event is important too, Dorothy. Maybe you could change your date. Your venue is more flexible. I couldn't believe what I was hearing. My wedding wasn't just a random event. It was one of the most important days of my life.
But my dad didn't see it that way.
He even offered to pay for Liam's event while refusing to contribute to my wedding. It was like a slap in the face. I stood my ground, refusing to change the date, but the damage was done. The betrayal didn't end there. On my wedding day, Dad, Sarah, and Liam didn't show up. They were too busy hosting Liam's music event to bother attending my ceremony. My grandfather, Edward, who's always been my rock, stepped in to walk me down the aisle. Edward is a retired school principal, a man of integrity, and he's been there for me through everything. He gave me the strength to smile through the heartbreak. But that day wasn't just about betrayal. It was also the beginning of something bigger. After the wedding, I overheard Sarah boasting about how they planned to secure my grandfather's ranch and my father's assets for Liam. That's when I realized this wasn't just about a missed wedding. It was about a calculated effort to cut me out of the family altogether. I didn't know it then, but that discovery would set me on a path I never expected to take. A path of uncovering secrets, seeking justice, and reclaiming what was rightfully mine. This was only the beginning of my story, and I was about to learn just how far betrayal could go. After my wedding, I tried to focus on my new life with Jake, but I couldn't shake the sting of what had happened. My own father, the man I had once seen as my hero, had chosen my stepbrother Liam over me. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about everything that had led up to it. The favoritism, the dismissiveness, and Sarah's ever-tightening grip on my father. I couldn't stop thinking about the conversation I overheard at the reception. Sarah had been speaking to one of her friends, laughing as she talked about how she and Liam would soon have everything they wanted. "The ranch is practically ours," she said. "Once Richard finalizes the paperwork, there won't be anything left for Dorothy." Hearing those words was like a punch to the gut. The ranch she was talking about belonged to my grandfather Edward. It had been in our family for generations, and he always said it would go to me someday. But now it seemed like Sarah had other plans. I knew she had always been manipulative, but this was a new low. I couldn't let it go. That night, Jake and I stayed up talking. I told him everything, the favoritism, the betrayal, and Sarah's scheming. He held my hand and said, "Dorothy, you have to do something about this. You can't let them take what's yours." Jake was right. I wasn't going to sit back and let Sarah and Liam destroy what little family legacy I had left. The next morning, I went to see my grandfather. Edward greeted me with his warm smile, the same one that had comforted me through so many tough times. We sat on the porch of his ranch, the Texas sun shining down on us, as I told him everything. He listened quietly, his face growing more serious with every word. When I finished, he nodded and said, "Dorothy, I've suspected for a while that Sarah was up to no good, but I didn't realize it had gone this far." Edward told me that he had noticed strange behavior from Richard lately, avoiding family gatherings, making excuses for Sarah's actions, and even asking odd questions about the ranch's ownership. Edward had dismissed it as Richard being under Sarah's thumb, but now he saw it for what it was, a coordinated effort to take control of the family's assets. We decided to dig deeper. With Jake's help, we began gathering evidence. I started with my father's financial records, which wasn't easy to access, but Edward had an old friend who worked in banking and owed him a favor. What we found was shocking. Large sums of money had been transferred from my father's accounts to Sarah and Liam's joint account. It was clear that Sarah had been funneling my dad's wealth to fund Liam's music career. But that wasn't the worst of it. We discovered that Sarah and Liam had forged Richard's signature on several documents, including one that attempted to transfer partial ownership of the ranch to Liam. My stomach churned as I realized the lengths they were willing to go. They weren't just trying to cut me out, they were trying to steal everything. Armed with this information, I decided it was time to confront my father. I couldn't do it alone, though. Jake and Edward agreed to come with me for support. We went to my dad's house one evening, and when he opened the door, he looked surprised to see me. "Dorothy," he said, his voice cautious. "What's going on?" I stepped inside, my heart pounding. "We need to talk, Dad," I said firmly. Sarah was sitting on the couch, her usual smug expression on her face. Liam was there too, strumming his guitar like he didn't have a care in the world. "What's this about?" Sarah asked, feigning innocence. I took a deep breath and laid the evidence on the table. The bank records, the forged documents, everything. "This is about you stealing from my family," I said, my voice shaking with anger. Sarah's face twisted into a scowl. "I don't know what you're talking about," she said, but her voice lacked conviction. Liam tried to play it cool, shrugging and saying, "This is ridiculous. You're just bitter because Dad chose to support me." My father sat in stunned silence, staring at the documents. "Is this true, Sarah?" he asked finally, his voice barely above a whisper. She didn't answer. Instead, she turned on me. "You've always been jealous of Liam," she snapped. "You couldn't stand to see someone else get attention, so you're trying to ruin us." I couldn't believe the audacity. "This isn't about jealousy," I said. "This is about you manipulating my father and trying to steal what doesn't belong to you." My dad stood up, his hands trembling as he looked at Sarah. "You told me these were just routine papers," he said. "You told me." His voice broke, and for the first time, I saw genuine regret in his eyes. "What have I done?" Sarah didn't try to deny it anymore. Instead, she turned defensive, accusing me of trying to tear the family apart. Liam joined in, saying I was just being selfish. But their words didn't matter. I had the truth, and now my father saw it too. The confrontation ended with my dad asking Sarah and Liam to leave the house. They protested, of course, but he was firm. I could see the pain in his eyes as he realized how blind he'd been, but I wasn't ready to forgive him. Not yet. That night, as I sat with Jake and Edward, I felt a mix of emotions, relief that the truth was out, anger at everything Sarah and Liam had done, and sadness for the father I had lost to their lies. But I also felt a spark of determination. This wasn't over. Not yet. The confrontation with my dad had been exhausting, but it was far from the end. Sarah and Liam might have been kicked out of his house, but I knew they weren't done. If anything, they'd double down now that they'd been exposed. I couldn't let my guard down, not with everything I'd uncovered so far. The morning after the confrontation, Jake, Grandpa Edward, and I sat down to review the evidence again. We needed to ensure we hadn't missed anything. As we sifted through bank statements, emails, and legal documents, a disturbing pattern emerged. Sarah wasn't just controlling my dad. She'd been manipulating him for years, slowly isolating him from the rest of the family, while draining his resources. Edward leaned back in his chair, his face stern. "Dorothy, this isn't just about greed. This is about control." Sarah saw Richard as her way to secure her son's future, no matter the cost.
He was right.
Sarah had systematically dismantled my father's relationships, starting with me. Every missed recital, every ignored birthday, it was all part of her plan to make Liam the sole focus of my dad's life. And now, with their sights set on the ranch and my father's remaining assets, they weren't going to back off easily. Later that week, I received a call from my cousin, Laura. She had been at a recent family gathering and overheard Sarah talking to someone about selling the ranch. "Dorothy, I don't know the details," Laura said, her voice worried, but it sounded like she's already looking for buyers. I felt my stomach drop. The ranch wasn't hers to sell. It wasn't even my father's to sell. It belonged to Edward. But the thought of Sarah even trying was enough to send me into a panic. I immediately called Edward, who reassured me that no transactions had taken place. "But it shows how desperate they are," he said. "We need to act fast." At Jake's suggestion, we hired a lawyer to protect Edward's property legally. We secured the ranch under a trust in my name, ensuring Sarah and Liam couldn't touch it. While it gave us some peace of mind, it also painted a target on my back. Sarah and Liam wouldn't take this lying down. Sure enough, the next move came quickly. One evening, while Jake and I were going over wedding photos, I received an email from an unknown address. The subject line read, "You're not as safe as you think." My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside was a single sentence: "If you think this is over, you're wrong." I felt a chill run down my spine. Jake immediately called our lawyer, who advised us to document everything. We filed a police report, but there wasn't much they could do without knowing who sent the email. Still, the message was clear. Sarah and Liam were trying to intimidate me. The next few weeks were tense. I kept looking over my shoulder, expecting them to show up or try something drastic. And then it happened. One night, as Jake and I were returning from dinner, we found Liam sitting in his car outside our house. He wasn't alone, Sarah was with him. "What are you doing here?" I demanded as I approached their car. Sarah rolled down the window, her face cold and calculating. "We're here to talk," she said. "You've made things very difficult for us, Dorothy." "Difficult for you?" I snapped. "You tried to steal from my family, from my grandfather. What do you want?" Liam leaned forward, smirking. "You're so dramatic. We just want what's fair."
"You don't need that ranch, Dorothy.
"It's too much for you to handle. Dad always said it should go to the person who can make the most of it." I couldn't believe their audacity. "Fair?" I said, my voice rising. "You mean stealing everything I've ever loved and worked for? You've been leeching off my dad for years, and now you think you can bully me into giving you what's not yours." Sarah's smirk faded, replaced by a glare. "You're making a mistake, Dorothy. We're family, and family should share." "Family?" I said, my voice shaking with anger. "You don't know the first thing about family." Jake stepped forward, his voice firm. "This conversation is over. If you don't leave, we're calling the police." Sarah opened her mouth to argue, but Liam pulled her back. "Let's go," he muttered. They drove off, but the tension lingered long after they were gone. That night, I realized just how far they were willing to go. They weren't just trying to intimidate me, they wanted to break me. But I wasn't going to let them. I had come too far to back down now. The fight wasn't over yet, but I was ready for whatever came next. After Liam and Sarah showed up outside my house, I knew the time had come to end this once and for all. Their boldness was terrifying, but it also fueled my determination. They had already caused so much damage, and I wasn't going to let them take anything else from me or my family. The next morning, Jake, Grandpa Edward, and I met with our lawyer to finalize the protective measures for the ranch. Edward was surprisingly calm for someone whose legacy had been under siege. "Dorothy," he said, his voice steady, "these people thrive on fear. The best way to beat them is to stand firm and let the truth do the work." That night, however, they tried something new. I received another email, this one containing a threat. It said if I didn't relinquish the ranch, they would expose personal details about my life to the public. It was laughable. They had nothing on me, but the fact they were resorting to blackmail showed how desperate they were. Instead of panicking, I forwarded the email to our lawyer and Jake, who both agreed it was time to take stronger action. I decided to file for a restraining order against both Sarah and Liam. It wasn't easy. The process involved presenting all the evidence we had collected, emails, their appearances outside my house, and testimonies from Jake and Edward. The judge granted the restraining order, which felt like a small victory, but I knew it wouldn't be the end. The breaking point came 2 weeks later. I received a call from my dad, Richard. It was late at night, and his voice sounded strained. "Dorothy," he said, "I need to see you. Please, it's important." I hesitated. My father had been manipulated for so long that I didn't know if I could trust him. But something in his voice made me agree.
"Fine," I said.
"But we're meeting at Grandpa's ranch." When he arrived, he looked like a shadow of the man I used to know. His face was pale, and there were dark circles under his eyes. "Dorothy," he began, "I've made a terrible mistake." I crossed my arms, keeping my distance. "You've made plenty, Dad." "Which one are you talking about?" He sighed heavily and sat down on the porch steps. "Sarah and Liam, they've been lying to me for years. After you confronted us, I started digging into the finances. They've drained me, Dorothy. I'm nearly broke." For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. But then I remembered everything he had done, or failed to do, to protect me. "And now you want my help?" I asked, my voice cold. "After everything they've put me through?" He shook his head. "No, I don't expect forgiveness. I just want to make things right." He pulled out a folder and handed it to me. Inside were more documents, bank statements, contracts, and emails. It was a treasure trove of evidence against Sarah and Liam. "What is this?" I asked. "It's everything I have," he said. "Proof of how they manipulated me, forged my signature, and stole from me.
Use it however you need to."
I just want to stop them." It was a shocking moment. For the first time in years, my father was standing up to Sarah and Liam. But I wasn't ready to trust him completely. "Why now?" I asked. "Why not years ago, when they started tearing this family apart?" He looked at me, his eyes filled with regret. "Because I was a coward. I let them control me, because I didn't want to lose them. But I see now that I lost you instead, and I can't live with that." I took the folder and nodded. "Thank you. But don't think this fixes everything." The next day, armed with the new evidence, I met with our lawyer and Edward. Together, we built an airtight case against Sarah and Liam. We filed charges of fraud, forgery, and theft, and the authorities moved quickly. Within days, Sarah and Liam were served with legal papers. But they didn't go quietly. Liam took to social media, accusing me of being a gold-digging daughter who turned her family against him. Sarah made similar claims to anyone who would listen. It was ugly, but I refused to engage. The truth was on my side, and I let the legal system handle the rest. In the end, justice prevailed. Sarah and Liam were found guilty of fraud and forgery, and they were ordered to repay everything they had stolen. The court also barred them from coming within 100 yards of me, Jake, or Edward. The ranch was safe, and so was my future. As for my dad, he tried to rebuild our relationship. I allowed him small steps, but the trust we once had was gone. It would take years to heal, if it ever did. Jake and I moved into the ranch full-time, starting a new chapter of our lives. Edward was thrilled to see the property thriving again, and he and Jake bonded over the renovations. I often think about what might have happened if I had stayed silent, if I had let Sarah and Liam win. But then I remember the strength I found in standing up for myself and my family. Betrayal may have scarred me, but it didn't break me. In the end, I proved that justice and resilience can overcome even the deepest wounds.